Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 376 Asher. According to the time, Urin should have come to Pentus with our gifts. In the city of Pike, the gloomy corridor connects the main castle and the Blood Keep. According to legend, thousands of years ago, all the sons of River King were massacred here. They were chopped into pieces while sleeping and sent back to their father, which is why the Blood Keep got its name. The outside of the castle is covered with white salt crystals and green lichens, while the inside of the castle is impermeable to light. It is tightly sealed and looks particularly gloomy. A thin man with a slightly haggard face sat in the magnificent hall of the Blood Keep, holding a glass of scarlet wine in his hand, with grilled sausages and pickled fish in front of him, and spoke in a hoarse voice. He is King Balon Greyjoy, the leader of the Iron Islands. Now he wears the driftwood crown that he was forced to take off because of the rebellion several years ago. In the hall of the Blood Keep, his third brother Victorian sat on his left, and on Balon's right was his eldest daughter Asher Greyjoy. Asher is about the same age as Viserys. She just completed her coming of age ceremony last year. She has a slim figure, long legs, short black hair, and a slightly upturned nose. Father, will Viserys agree to our terms? Asher used a knife and fork to split a piece of beef on the plate and then put it in her mouth. The girl has a strong personality and a hot temper, just like a man. While chewing the beef, she asked with a little concern. This is a family dinner of the Greyjoy family. However, the second brother, Euron Greyjoy, has been sent to Pentus by his eldest brother. The fourth brother, Aaron, is presiding over a ceremony of the drowned god on Great White Island, and is also not in Pike City. Now only Asher and Victorian are left. Humph, if he doesn't agree, we will go to the Baratheon family. Balon sat at the head of the long table, holding a shining knife in his hand while eating, and sneered hoarsely. Even if he agrees, we will contact the Baratheon family. Asher, you have to understand that, if the Ironborn want to conquer the Greenland and plunder more wealth, land, and women, they must constantly create chaos, and never let them settle down. Due to the unique geographical environment, the Iron Islands are inhabited by a group of people who are independent, fierce, and even brutal by nature. They call themselves Ironborn. The land of the Iron Islands is barren and difficult to cultivate. There is an abundance of cheap iron ore, and the population is not large. They can only rely on plundering to survive. Therefore, the Ironborn have been plundering since ancient times. However, because there are not many Ironborn, it is bound to be difficult to conquer the Greenland, so the Ironborn have always used the method of creating chaos to fight for survival space. And Asher naturally understood what her father said. Her father wanted to have the best of both worlds. He used the advantages of the Iron Fleet to eat both sides at the same time, to maintain a balance and let the Greenland continue to be chaotic. This is also the method used by countless generations of Ironborn. It's just that the girl is slightly dissatisfied with her father's words about plundering wealth, land, and women. However, Asher did not sympathize with the plight of the girls who were plundered. Following the ancient way, to pay iron money was the tradition of the Iron Race. What she wanted to do was to plunder men, to plunder more and better looking men. Why can only men plunder women, but she can't catch a few good looking men to take back to the Iron Islands, to be her sole husband? Balon naturally didn't know what his daughter was thinking, but even if he knew Asher's thoughts, he might not blame her, who made his youngest son Theon become a hostage because of the defeat many years ago, and was adopted by Duke Eddard Stark as his adopted son, and Asher was his only heir. However, what Balon did not mention to Asher was that he would contact Robert Baratheon next, and use the threat of the Targaryen family to try to get his son Theon back. But at this moment, the girl looked at her father whom she admired in her heart, and her father's thin face was serious, with long grey hair hanging on his back, and then he spoke. If the Greenland cannot be unified, the Iron Race will never be able to raise their heads. The Mad King's son will agree, because the Iron Throne is not his yet. Why would he not agree? Then Balon forked another piece of sausage into his mouth, chewed it with his pale teeth, His grey beard trembled slightly and then emphasized it again. He will agree. However, at this moment, the sound of metal chain rings outside the hall sounded, and a Mr. with grey hair and a grey robe hurriedly walked in from the hall of Blood Castle. He was the Mr. Quillen of Pike City. Now he was holding a short note in his hand, and then he spoke in a hurried voice. King Balan, something bad has happened. He received a letter of help from Black Tide Island not long ago. The person who sent the letter of help was the drowned god priest of Black Tide Island. In the letter, they claimed that they had been attacked by the White Walkers, and most of the island had fallen, and only the castle was still struggling to hold on. When the voice of Mr. Quillen fell, the entire hall of Blood Castle was silent. Sitting on the first throne, King Balan, with grey hair, still picked up a piece of sausage with a fork and put it into his mouth, chewing slowly, as if he didn't hear what Mr. Quillen said. On the other side, Balan's third brother Victorian was silent from beginning to end. He was tall and mighty, a strong warrior and a very capable fleet commander on the battlefield, and he was also very calm and composed outside the battlefield. But at this time, Victorian couldn't accept what Mr. Quillen said. He slammed the knife and fork in his hand on the table and spoke in a low voice. Mr. Quillen, you are not kidding, right? Those White Walkers don't have warships. Did they swim to Black Tide Island? Victorian didn't want to believe it, and Asher on the other side turned her head and looked at her father with a slightly panicked expression. Unlike her uncle, Asher believed that Black Tide Island didn't have the courage to make such a joke. Father, what should we do? Regardless of whether the White Walkers can row or swim, since they can attack the Black Tide Island silently, they can magically appear in King's Harbor in the next second. My father had just made up his mind to sit back and watch the fight. Anyway, the Iron Islands would not be attacked by the White Walkers, so let the usurper and Viserys fight each other, and both suffer losses. However, not long after my father finished speaking, the White Walkers attacked the Iron Islands in a flash. Asher was a little curious about what choice her father should make at this time. My lord. Mr. Quillen heard Victorian's doubts, and coupled with the indifference of King Balan, he was a little anxious. Vic. At this time, King Balan finally spoke. His face was gloomy, and he didn't know what he was thinking. He held the knife and fork tightly in his hand, and the veins on the back of his hand bulged. Take the fleet to sea. Chapter 377 Rescue of Kuroshio Island. No matter what the reason is, since the Black Tide Island has asked for help, as the king of the Iron Islands, Balan Greyjoy must go to rescue, otherwise he will not have the face to gain a foothold in the Iron Race. Therefore, Balan sent his third brother Victorian, who is good at fighting, to lead the Iron Fleet docked in King's Harbor to the Black Tide Island to explore the truth. Among the four brothers of the Greyjoy family, the eldest brother Balan Greyjoy is cruel and ruthless, but he has responsibility. He is stubborn, fearless, competitive, and uncompromising. He is an Iron King who truly regards the revival of the Iron Race as his own responsibility. The second brother Euron, the Evil Eye, is vicious, crazy and cunning, and selfish. He is completely opposite to his eldest brother's desire to truly revive the glory of the Iron Race. He only wants to do things that are beneficial to himself. If Euron is here, he may go against Balan's idea. And the old Victorian may not be a qualified Iron King. His ambition cannot overcome his inner sense of responsibility, but he is an excellent commander and captain. He admired his eldest brother Balan so much that when his eldest brother started talking, Victorian shut up and said nothing more. Instead, he put down his knife and fork, pushed his plate, and stood up from his seat. Okay, brother. Victorian didn't even eat his meal after hearing his eldest brother's words. He was ready to start the Iron Fleet and set off to Black Tide Island for support. Looking at the tall and mighty figure of his third brother going away, Balan, who was sitting in the first seat, nodded with satisfaction. Asher, learn more from your third uncle. He is the bravest Iron Captain in the world. As long as he steps on a warship, no one can defeat him. Not too long after that, a melodious horn sounded from the King's Harbor on Pike Island. Victorian, wearing heavy armor and holding a huge axe, stood on the bow of his flagship, the invincible Iron Victory. The golden cloak fluttered in the sea breeze, and the sea monster flag of the Greyjoy family also fluttered in the sea breeze. Let's go. With Victorian's order, a fleet of iron ships weighed anchor and set sail from Kingsport. Under the setting sun, they split the waves on the sea and headed for Kuratide Island. Kuratide Island is located at the northernmost end of the Iron Islands, while Pike Island is the southernmost end of the Iron Islands. Fortunately, the Iron Islands are not large in size. There are only 7 main islands, and the rest are some insignificant small islands and reefs. It only took Victorian half a day to lead the Iron Fleet from Kingsport to Kuratide Island, but it was already late at night when they set out in the evening. It's a bit weird, so quiet. The entire Kuratide Island was silent without any sound, as if it was asleep, without any sign of being attacked, and even particularly peaceful and harmonious. However, considering that it is now close to the bat hour, it is indeed time for the Iron Race to sleep. Brother, what should we do? The Iron Fleet sailed silently on the sea, breaking through the waves. Victorian climbed onto the bow holding a heavy axe, and looked at the silent black tide island with the mist glasses in one hand. Then he put down the telescope in his hand and frowned slightly. The deputy beside him, Single-Ear Wolf, who only had one ear, did not have a telescope, and could not see the situation on Black Tide Island. Seeing their boss put down the telescope, he couldn't help but ask. They didn't know what happened on Black Tide Island. Victorian just said that Black Tide Island was attacked, and then led people over. Telescopes have always been a unique handicraft specialty of me. However, with the destruction of Mi City State, the craftsmen who mastered this technology were killed, and the telescopes left in the world have become more and more precious. The situation is a bit bad. Although Victorian did not believe what the old Meester said before he set out, saying that the White Walkers attacked Black Tide Island. But when he really arrived near Black Tide Island, he always felt uneasy in his heart. This was the keen sense of smell of a veteran who had been on the battlefield for a long time. After all, Black Tide Island was too quiet. There was only the sound of waves hitting the hull. There was no sound on the entire Black Tide Island, as if it was completely asleep. If Black Tide Island was attacked by the White Walkers as the creed on the Raven said, why was it so quiet? And the person who asked for help was not Bela Blacktace, the Lord of Black Tide Island. He went to harass the Shield Islands some time ago. This was just a priest on Black Tide Island asking for help. Could this letter of help be a disguise? Victorian is a good fighter, but he is not a reckless man. The logic in his brain is very clear. He carefully considered the whole thing, and felt that it seemed a little unusual. But if he came to Black Tide Island, but didn't even land on the island, and even didn't know what happened and returned empty-handed, Victorian would have no way to explain to his eldest brother. Then the Iron Captain took a sip of the strong liquor in the wine pot, made up his mind, and spoke to his deputy, One-Eared Wolf, beside him. Tell the brothers to keep their eyes open. We are going to land on Kuroshio Island. Understood. After hearing the boss's words, Dana Wolf nodded. Then he went down to tell the brothers to be alert. There might be something unusual on Kuroshio Island. Be ready for battle at any time. Not too long later, this Iron Fleet, under the command of Victorian, gradually approached the beach of Kuroshio Island. Crash, the waves hit the beach. The worst thing to do when sailing at night is to approach reefs in the dark, otherwise you may not know the way, and may crash the boat. Relatively speaking, the beach is safer. As the longboat approached the beach, the Ironborn on the Iron Fleet jumped off the boat silently. Plop, they jumped into the sea water up to their thighs, dragging ropes in their hands to push the boat onto the shallows and fix it to prevent it from being carried away by the waves, and having no way to retreat. The Ironborn did not need to be commanded to do this, and seemed very familiar with it. They used this method to attack the coastal villages of the Greenland, and even carried the boat to attack. Victorian also stepped on the beach of Black Tide Island, holding a great axe in one hand, watching the Ironborn busy fixing the ship, then raised his head and looked around. There was a deathly silence around him, with only the sound of waves hitting the beach and the Ironborn fixing the longship. Something is wrong. However, Victorian's inner uneasiness became more and more obvious, and it has been like this since he set foot on this land. His breathing was a little heavy, and he kept looking around, as if he wanted to detect something. But unfortunately, the night on Black Tide Island was rich, and the moonlight was dim tonight, so his vision was limited, and he could not see too far. At this moment, a black shadow seemed to flash across Victorian's field of vision. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 378, Urine Surrenders. Who is it? Victorian immediately became alert, and his inner anxiety finally reached its peak at this moment. Torches. Then the Iron Captain could no longer bear it, and asked his subordinates to light torches to dispel the darkness around them, wanting to see clearly what was happening. Hover torches were lit in an instant, and the darkness around them was dispelled. Victorian took the torch, and looked at the place where the figure just swayed, and then his breathing instantly tightened. As the only light in the darkness, densely packed figures gathered on the beach at some point, and their countless pairs of blue eyes looked at Victorian at this moment. The next second, horrifying roars came from the mouths of these monsters, and then surged towards the iron race like a tide. Run. Everyone flee to the sea. When Victorian saw the mountains and seas of whites rushing towards them in an instant, he felt the hair on the back of his neck explode. Push the longboat into the sea. Then the Iron Captain swung the great axe in his hand, and with a click, he chopped down a white head on, and then shouted loudly to the back. But at this time, Victorian's orders were no longer needed, and all the Ironborn knew what to do. They had demonstrated countless times when they plundered the Greenlands. When they encountered trouble, they quickly fled to the sea. On the sea, the Ironborn were still invincible, and they were all proficient in water. However, the speed at which the whites surged up was still faster than the speed at which the Ironborn pushed the boat. They all let out a creepy howl, and then threw the sailors to the ground one by one. Kill. Although Victorian was startled, he did not panic and remained calm. He swung the great axe left and right to chop the whites that rushed up in half. But there were too many whites, and they were fearless. Although the Ironborn were fierce, they were defeated and suffered heavy casualties. Go to hell. Victorian raised his great axe and chopped a charging white in half again. The great axe hit the beach fiercely, and dust and sand flew everywhere. His body was covered with blood, and his face looked a little hideous, and his chest rose and fell as he gasped. The situation was over. Sweat kept falling from his forehead, and Victorian gritted his teeth tightly. As a veteran of the Iron Islands, he could see the situation on the battlefield clearly. The iron races were finished, and this iron fleet would be buried on this beach. And this was because of his negligence. If he could be more careful. Damn it. Victorian now just wanted to slap himself in the face a few times, but now that the mistake had been made, it was too late to say these things. The night was thick, and the fighting on the beach of Black Tide Island continued. Caca. Then Victorian chopped down a few more whites, and without hesitation, turned around and plunged into the sea. Time passed quickly. November, 292 Egan calendar. The Dead Army in Westeros rowed boats to attack the Iron Islands. This news was like a nuclear bomb detonating, causing an unprecedented earthquake in the free trade cities. Originally, people in the free trade cities held a bystander's perspective on the disaster in Westeros, and some even gloated over it. However, now that the White Walkers rowed boats to attack the Iron Islands, it means that they may cross the sea to attack the SS continent at any time in the future. This made the lords of the trade cities unable to sit still, and they did not want to see the war burn to their homes. In the city of Pentus, Viserys heard the news and quickly convened a royal meeting, and all high-level commanders attended. It was mainly to make a preliminary tone for the next plan to attack Westeros, and everyone could express their opinions, because the fact that the White Walkers could row boats did make Viserys feel threatened and urgent. The Iron Islands, which were actually attacked by the Dead Army from the sea, became the object of no one's concern. The final result of the Battle of Black Tide Island was that the Iron Fleet led by Victorian was ambushed and annihilated. The Ironborn who managed to climb aboard and escape back to Pike claimed that Lord Victorian had jumped into the sea. However, Balance sent people to search, but could not find Victorian's whereabouts. The life and death of this Iron Captain is still unknown. The Ironborn said that he might have returned to the Palace of Flowing Waters. The drowned god needed a great captain. The news of the White Walkers attacking the Iron Islands reached Pentus, and Euron Greyjoy, who led an iron fleet here more than half a month ago, was also shocked. He never thought that he would suddenly become a dog without a home. However, Uran, who was cunning and crazy by nature, did not panic because of this, but quickly calmed himself down. The madness in his genes made him keenly judge that this was not only a huge crisis, enough to destroy the Greyjoy family and even the Iron Islands, but also an unprecedented opportunity. If he seized the opportunity, he could rise to prominence. After wavering between family and individual, the captain of the Serenity quickly came up with an answer after a brief thought. He made a bold decision. He was not going to lead his fleet back to the Iron Islands. Instead, he took the initiative to find Viserys and expressed his willingness to surrender. He led his fleet to join the Targaryen Legion and help the true king regain the Iron Throne. Viserys was a little surprised by the sudden surrender of Euron, the Evil Eye. In his impression, Euron should be an ambitious and extremely crazy person. He thought that, after receiving this news, Euron would lead the fleet back to the Iron Islands as soon as possible to gather people's hearts and stabilize the overall situation, but he did not expect that the other party would be even crazier than he imagined. He simply didn't want his home. However, Euron is an experienced captain after all, and he also leads a powerful Iron fleet second only to the new Dragonstone fleet. The sailors and iron races on the ship are all good at naval battles. Although it is just icing on the cake, Viserys still accepted Euron's loyalty. Ramsay Snow, the bastard of the Dreadfort, Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, the first evil man in the Seven Kingdoms, who was imprisoned in the water dungeon and was still half dead, Petty Baelish, the conspirator, and now Euron is here again. Viserys suddenly realized that his place was really a den of filth, gathering all the notorious villains in the Seven Kingdoms now and in the future. The White Walkers bypassed the neck and attacked the Iron Islands from the sea, and Euron led the Iron Fleet to surrender. Boom boom. Thousands of horses galloped, and 20,000 Dothraki roaring warriors who settled on the Great Plains rushed to Pentos. The Targaryen family finally began to gather strength and show their true muscles. And it was at this time Dr. Marwyn, who also came to Pentos half a month ago with Euron, also made a breakthrough in the translation of classics. Chapter 379 Dr. Marwyn, the magician, came to Pentos half a month ago, and his purpose was to find Viserys. But in fact, it was not the first time for the two to meet. They had a small encounter before. The short and strong Maester who Viserys and Maya saw in the Valyrian ruins was Dr. Marwyn, but unfortunately, the two did not recognize each other at that time, so there was no communication. When Viserys met the famous magician Dr. Marwyn in the study, he immediately recognized him. At that time, Viserys and Maya rode Balerion to escape from the Valyrian capital, and Dr. Marwyn also escaped from the Valyrian ruins by some unknown means. But the old Maester naturally had no way to fly back to Pentos as fast as Viserys in a few days without a dragon. He also guessed that the other party might be Viserys when he saw the dragon coming that night. Then, the magician Dr. Marwyn escaped from the Valyrian ruins in a low profile, boarded a merchant ship, and traveled thousands of miles to Pentos, and finally found the legendary young dragon lord. Dr. Marwyn is different from other Maesters in the Citadel. He has always been a maverick, and his ideas are quite different from those of the Maesters in the Citadel. The Citadel hopes to create a world dominated by knowledge, and promote human progress and the development of productivity through Maesters. In this world, there is no magic, no dragons, and even no gods. There is nothing that can threaten human development. Dr. Marwyn is a doctor who studies magic and mysticism. He is the only one in the entire Citadel who has obtained the Valyrian steel chain link. Therefore, he naturally has different views from other doctors in the Citadel, and even calls his companions grey sheep. He believes that, since this world has these mysterious powers, there is a reason for his existence. Humans should study magic and master magic to bring a better life. After Viserys received Dr. Marwyn and learned about his intention, he immediately gave him some precious books brought out from the ruins of Valyria for proofreading. Some of these books have become blurred and even fragile because of the long time. They will break into pieces with a slight touch of fingers, while others are simply stuck together and cannot be separated by hand. It takes a professional special technique to peel off the paper. Many of the books from the Valyria period brought back by Viserys have been severely damaged, and Dr. Marwyn was heartbroken when he saw them. However, there was no other way. When Viserys fled with these books, he was attacked by a demonized dragon. After a desperate fight, he finally escaped. These books were inevitably damaged. After receiving these books, Dr. Marwyn began to concentrate on studying translation and proofreading, trying to identify the original meaning through the blurred handwriting one by one. Now his research has finally made a breakthrough and discovered a major secret. Your Majesty, the short and fat old scholar who looked like a bull hurried over while Viserys was teasing a baby dragon in the garden. It was the little silver dragon hatched from the 5th dragon egg. Its mother might have encountered some trouble when giving birth to it, or the magic power in her body was insufficient, which caused the baby dragon to be born with some malnutrition and looked extremely weak. However, it still relied on its strong desire for life and finally used all its strength to break the eggshell and crawl out. However, after the little silver dragon came out, it didn't even have the strength to eat the eggshell. It lay on the ground and panted for a long time before it barely pulled itself up and ate its own eggshell. The last little silver dragon didn't change much after eating its own eggshell. It just had brighter scales and looked more energetic, but it was still much worse than the other brothers and sisters. The other 4 little dragons were all full of energy. The little silver dragon was a male dragon. Viserys and the other 2 girls were also very happy that he could break out of the eggshell and save his life. But Viserys hesitated slightly on its name. Its other brothers and sisters had already been named after the gods of ancient Valyria, and they were also full of profound meanings. As for the little silver dragon, which was obviously born with malnutrition and looked weak and powerless, Viserys considered it again and again and gave the little silver dragon a very casual name, Silver Nugget. In Valyrian, Silver Nugget and Silver are almost the same, so it can also be called Silver. His reason was that it was easy to feed it with a bad name. As a father who hatched 5 little dragons, he did not expect Silver Nugget to become a terrifying sky overlord in this state. It was enough for it to grow up smoothly. While Viserys was teasing the silver that had grown a little, Dr. Marwyn hurried over. He made a major discovery in the translation and proofreading of the classics. The owner of these books was extraordinary. Viserys speculated that he was at least one of the 40 ancient nobles with the same status as the Targaryen family, or even higher. The books he collected were naturally extremely precious. Dr. Marwyn picked out a word from the fragments of these books. Demon. Demon. Viserys stood up and asked with some doubt. The little silver dragon spread its wings and landed on his shoulder. Although Dr. Marwyn had a serious expression on his face, he couldn't help but look at the dragon a few more times. These little guys are really the most beautiful creatures in the world. Then Dr. Bull couldn't help but exclaimed. He was extremely enthusiastic about magic and all mystical studies, and dragons were naturally included. Their flying figures in the sky made him fascinated. The reason why he came to Viserys was to see more dragons. Dr. Marwyn's disciple once thought so. She was Miri Mazdur, who followed Viserys the earliest. It's a pity that, although this witch mastered magical magic, she didn't guard against the malice of people's hearts, and was killed by Gillian Lannister. However, although he was obsessed with dragons, Dr. Marwyn still didn't forget why he came here. Then he sorted out his words and spoke again. That's right, Your Majesty. Through the information I have compiled over this period of time, I have solid evidence to prove that the Valyrian Freehold and the Devil are fully connected. Chapter 380 Devil's Breath. Demon. However, Viserys frowned and said, Doctor, are you kidding? Viserys' face was full of doubts. How could demons really appear if they were just legends? But in fact, after hearing what Dr. Marwyn said, the silver-haired young man's heart also skipped a beat. The books he gave to Dr. Marwyn for proofreading were not all of them. He also had a book that the demonized Valyrian noble pointed out to him before his death. Although Viserys didn't know what the other party wanted to express, the book was more like a miscellany. Perhaps it was written by the Valyrian noble on the eve of the crisis, and he wanted to tell the future generations something. The word demon was mentioned above. Viserys flipped through the miscellany after returning to Pentus, but the content was very messy, and many parts of it were already blurred. In addition, due to the gap in language changes over hundreds of years, visitors had some difficulty reading it. The whole article was filled with a series of words such as demon, black, terror, etc. At that time, visitors also doubted whether there was really a deal between Valyria and the legendary demon. Then, that night, Viserys had a dream related to the doomsday scourge of Valyria. He dreamed that the sky was collapsing, the earth was tearing apart, the seawater poured back into the sinking continent, submerging the palace, town and temple, and the 14 fire fronts across the Valyria Peninsula all spewed out thick black fog, and hundreds of dragons soared in the sky, roaring silently. He saw a white-bearded giant with a 7-star crown on his head and a warhammer in his hand. He saw a lady wrapped in a black robe crying silently with her arms around her knees. He saw a floating corpse with chains tied to his hands and feet. He saw a black goat gnawing on flesh and blood. He saw a black bird combing its feathers with pale eyes. And he saw a bull of sun. These people are. But in the end he saw all the faces of the existence swapped. Viserys' heart suddenly tightened slightly, as if a big hand suddenly strangled his neck, making him unable to breathe. The white-bearded giant was wrapped in a black robe, the weeping lady raised her goat head, and the floating corpse with its hands and feet tied up with chains, turned into a black bird, and broke free of the chains and flew away. When the silver-haired young man looked at the group of monsters in a panic, he did not notice that a pair of pale jade-like hands slowly climbed up the neck of the silver-haired young man. However, the grand spectacle of the doomsday scourge of Valyria continued. This was not the first time that Viserys had dreamed of the doomsday scourge. He had dreamed of it once many years ago, but at that time there was no such bizarre scene, only the doomsday scene of the world collapsing. But at this time, Viserys seemed to hear the land wailing and crying in his dream. The mother and son who had been reunited after a long separation in the first dream were once again turned into ashes under the gushing magma. The black mist rising from the 14 fire peaks turned into a fist and suddenly slammed into the sky. The jade hand behind Viserys that was about to climb up his neck suddenly retreated at this time. Then the fist condensed from the black fog exploded and fell into a black blood rain all over the sky. The fiery red clouds sprinkled broken dragon crystals, and the 14 fire peaks collapsed into 14 bottomless abysses. The Valyrian peninsula was also torn apart in an instant under the heavy hammer. The surging and turbulent waves swept across the land of long summer, and even the Slavers' Bay was not spared. A large number of pyramids were destroyed, and the city walls collapsed. The Valyrian Free Fortress, the most prosperous, powerful, prestigious empire in human history that could challenge the gods, perished and vanished. It was at this time that Viserys suddenly sat up and woke up from this nightmare. The soft feather bed was soaked with his sweat, and the cold sweat on his forehead continued to flow and drip onto the gorgeous velvet bedding. The future queen, Princess Irian Martel of Dawn, and the third sister of the Sand Snake sisters, who were sleeping beside the young king, were also awakened. Tyene wrapped her naked body around Viserys and gently kissed his chest. However, after Viserys adjusted his emotions, he did not tell the two women the specific details of his dream. He just hugged Irian gently and told them that he had a nightmare. No one except Irian and Tyene knew that Viserys had a nightmare, and the women who slept with Viserys did not know what he dreamed about. The viewpoint put forward by Dr. Marwyn was even more surprising. He not only believed that the legendary Helen demons were real, but also believed that the Valyrians had made a deal with these demons. Valyrian steel weapons, the powerful magic mastered by the Valyrians, and the enslavement of countless slaves to explore the underground world under the 14 fire peaks. All of these are directly related to demons. And Dr. Marwyn was able to find clues of evidence in the batch of precious books provided by Viserys. For example, a book about the forging of Valyrian steel mentioned that the key to forging Valyrian steel is a need for demon's breath to purify the steel and add magic. Dr. Marwyn was very sure that this word was the word demon in High Valyrian. As for what the devil's breath was, Dr. Marwyn himself didn't know, but according to the description in the book, it seemed to be a black gas. At the same time, a travelogue also recorded it. A noble of Freehold, his dignity was challenged by civilians. Although the citizens of Freehold had power, it was not enough to challenge the honor of the Bellarys family. The lord used his magic to punish the poor guy. He turned into a ball of black mist, then appeared in front of the other party, strangled his neck, and then stripped the poor guy of his life. This seems to be a magic that only the highest nobles of Freehold can master. Bellaris family? When Viserys heard the name of the Bellaris family, his expression moved slightly. Because the signature of the miscellaneous notes was Bellaris, it seemed that the family he entered was the Bellaris family. Your Majesty's guess is correct. These books may come from the Bellaris family. Dr. Marwyn confirmed Viserys' guess because he saw the shepherd's emblem on the bookmark. And among those books, there is a book about exploring the continent of Sithorius. The author of this book is none other than Janina Bellaris. She once rode her dragon to the south of the known world to find the legendary boiling ocean and steaming rivers. She went further than any previous expedition team, but she only saw endless rainforests, deserts, and mountains. When she returned to the Valyrian Freehold 3 years later, she declared that Sithorius was as big as Essos and was a continent without end. If the views put forward by Dr. Marwyn were spread, they would surely cause a great sensation, but there might not be many people who believed them. Most of them would treat it as a joke. However, Viserys believed his words because he was the host of the Black Mist and because of the dream he had had. Valyria declared war on the gods, and the gods destroyed Valyria. But Valyria's soul is not dead. Dang, the bells of the Night Owl's palace rang melodiously and spread far away. I got up late. Sorry, I just finished the intensive review and I will be late for work. Chapter 381, Replacing the Prime Minister. The bells on the top of Pentus were melodious. Rumble, the horses galloped, the people shouted, and the horses neighed, and the endless war horses swept in. The 20,000 Dothraki roaring warriors who surrendered to the dragon-riding Khal rushed to the city of Pentus. The defenders on the top of Pentus seemed particularly nervous. The city gates were closed, and the citizens of Pentus also fell into a high degree of panic. However, the dragon roared in the sky, and the Dothraki rode on their horses, waving their araks, and enthusiastically shouted the name of the dragon-riding Khal, and the sound shook the earth. Khal Dragon. The most powerful Khal rode the strongest horse, and their Khal surrendered the dragon. What does this mean? This is simply the strongest on the surface of the earth. They have been recuperating on the Great Plains for so long that they feel that their scimitars have become blunt. Now they have finally received the order to prepare to cross the poisonous water and attack the 7 kingdoms. We will ride on the wooden horse, cross the poisonous water, cut off the heads of those cowards hiding under the iron, tear down their stone houses, rape their women, kill their children. All the children who exceed the wheels must not live. The Dothraki were full of vigor. Brandishing a Valyrian steel arak, Cargo leaped at the forefront of the array, his upper body naked, revealing his strong muscles, and roared loudly in Dothraki, his beard trembling slightly. Reclaim the iron chair for Khal the dragon. Cargo's roar then aroused a frenzy of cheers from the Dothraki, and they all started to make noises, making all kinds of ghostly howling sounds. Since the Bloody Century, the Dothraki, as the destroyers of civilization, have set foot on countless city-states on the continent of Essos, and the 7 kingdoms have escaped by chance because of their possession of the Narrow Sea. However, now, under the leadership of the great dragon-riding Khal, the people of the Horse God are about to cross the Narrow Sea and conquer new lands. The former deputy commander of the Windblown, Cargo, replaced Viserys to manage the 20,000 Dothraki howlers. The ancestor of this brave and warlike Dothraki mercenary seems to be a certain famous Khal. In his hand, he holds a very small number of Varak scimitars forged with dragon steel. Cargo was injured in the operation of capturing the Faceless Man, but the Faceless Man did not get too much advantage from him. He was also seriously injured, and finally died in the hands of Viserys. Cargo's injuries have naturally healed. In order to facilitate the management of the Khals, this Dothraki has now become the blood guard of the dragon-riding Khal. Koi koi. Cargo saw Viserys jumping off the dragon's back, and immediately turned over and dismounted, placed the scimitar in front of him, knelt on one knee, and shouted blood of my blood. And Viserys also helped him up. Then the Dothraki entered the city of Pentus. Although the Dothraki were barbaric, they would not smash, loot, or burn anything. After entering the city-state, they would wear gorgeous clothes, spray perfume, and try to be civilized in the city-state. But in their own tribe, they were bare-chested, covered with painted leather vests, tied with horsehair leggings, and tied with bronze belts. The Dothraki entered Pentus, symbolizing that the first batch of pioneers entering Westeros and the battle plan were ready. At the tense pre-war meeting, Oberyn was the first to resign from the position of acting prime minister. Because he had been looking forward to this moment for a long time, he had to lead his troops to Westeros in person and kill all the murderers who murdered his sister. Therefore, he could not be in the rear to coordinate the overall situation. At the same time, Oberyn nominated a candidate that no one expected. The Targaryen dynasty can safely end its term, and the outgoing prime minister has always had an unspoken rule of recommending an heir to the king. Before Joffrey Bracken stepped down as prime minister to become the Lord Admiral, he recommended Oberyn to Viserys as the next prime minister. Oberyn's term was a bit short, just over half a year, and then he took the initiative to resign and recommended Jon Connington, the Minister of Justice, who had a bad personal relationship with him. Oberyn's recommendation of the former prime minister of the Targaryen dynasty to resume his post was beyond everyone's expectations. Is Jon Connington capable? Of course, there is no doubt about it. Jon Connington was originally the prime minister of Aerys II. He once personally commanded the army loyal to the royal family to fight against the four major families of the Usurper Alliance and dispatched materials across the country. He managed them in an orderly manner and had strong abilities. It's just a pity that Jon Connington was defeated in the end and failed to save the fate of the Targaryen dynasty, which was about to collapse. But there are many factors for the defeat, and it may not be blamed on him alone. Jon's ability and experience as prime minister are beyond doubt, which is just right for the current situation. However, the problem is that Oberyn and the other party's relationship is not very harmonious, and there are even some conflicts. But even so, Oberyn is willing to recommend the other party, which really surprised and admired everyone present. In fact, Jon Connington is more in line with Viserys' expectations for the next prime minister. Although there are many talents in the new dynasty, Jon is the only one with relevant work experience, so he is naturally the best choice for the next prime minister. Joffrey Bracken, the first prime minister of the new dynasty since its establishment, has made outstanding contributions and accumulated merits to become the prime minister, while Oberyn, the second prime minister, has a high academic degree and 6 bachelor links that no one can compare to. Viserys was satisfied with Oberyn's recommendation, and then he sought Jon Connington's own opinion. Jon was indeed a little surprised, but in the end he did not refuse, but nodded and agreed. Oberyn handed the Medal of the King's Hand to Jon Connington, and the positions of the two officially changed. Oberyn became the Lord Chancellor, while Jon took over the post of Prime Minister and wore the Medal of the King's Hand on his chest. As the new Prime Minister during the war, Jon Connington's mission during his term must be revenge, whether it is his personal revenge or the revenge of the Targaryen family. Winning the next war and regaining the Iron Throne is the ultimate goal of the entire army. And there is a bigger obstacle to this goal, which is to repel the attack of the White Walkers first. This is an enemy that all mankind must face. Viserys originally wanted to wait a little longer, but the news that the White Walkers were going to attack the Iron Islands became the last straw that broke his bottom line. Chapter 382 Cersei's Plan. Demons. White Walkers. Gods. At night, Viserys sat quietly in the study and fell into deep thought. There were too many things happening recently, which made him feel a little anxious. The matter of the Black Mist has always been his biggest concern, because it involves himself, and now this mystery has finally made a breakthrough. Combining the miscellaneous notes left by the Valyrian nobles and the nightmare he had, some things can be basically inferred. The dreams in this world often have very strong implications. Viserys rarely dreams, and every time he dreams of something unusual. The gods destroyed Valyria because they found that Valyria was making a deal with the devil. Valyria was able to quickly rise from a small nomadic nation to a dragon herder because it made a deal with the devil. But what exactly is a devil? Viserys held the wine glass in his hand, and the crystal wine shook in the crystal glass, and then he took a sip. He used to be a person who hated tobacco and alcohol very much, but now he encountered some troubles and couldn't help but use it to divert his attention. At present, all the books that have been collected that mention the word demon do not explain clearly what this demon is. What do they look like? 3 heads? 9 arms? Or does this word that means demon or evil in Valyrian have other meanings, and the Valyrians do not mean this? But unfortunately, Viserys can collect very little information. Dr. Marwyn has also explained that only the most powerful families among the 40 ancient families can master the core secrets of the Free Fortress. The shepherd or dragon herder Bellarys family holds this secret, but the Targaryen family, which is at the bottom of the 40 families, is not included. Dream girl Daenerys Targaryen only predicted that a crisis would come and moved the whole family to Dragonstone, which was the outpost of the Free Fortress back then. The powerful Free Fortress enslaved many civilizations, but never set foot in Westeros, because in the records of the Targaryen family, there is a prophet of Valyria who predicted that the Sunset Sea region will breed a crisis that will destroy the world in the future, so the freehold stopped at Dragonstone. If the dream I had was true, then the last glimpse of the black fog that I saw when I escaped from Valyria might be the remains of the 14 Fire Peaks. Viserys couldn't help but think, and then a lot of questions came out. So what is under the remains of the 14 Fire Peaks? Where does the bottomless abyss lead to? 7 layers of hell? Or the home of demons? Why are the Valyrians obsessed with capturing slaves all over the world and then sending them to the 14 Fire Peaks to die? What do they want to find underground? He thought that the information obtained from this operation was enough to solve the mystery of the Black Fog, but he didn't expect it to lead to a bigger secret behind it and Viserys' curiosity. But curiosity is curiosity. Viserys is still very calm, knowing that now is not the time for him to make trouble. The problem of the White Walkers has not been solved yet, so he should not provoke the legendary demons now, otherwise the world will become a mess. Unless he can transfer the White Walkers, the army of the dead, and the Night King who have now swallowed up the entire north, to the ruins of Valyria. Let the demonized monsters, humans, sea monsters, and dragons in the ruins of Valyria fight against these army of the dead. If this is really possible, Viserys is still looking forward to it. Then his eyes fell on the map not far away, and the military plan jointly discussed by all the generals loyal to the Targaryen family during the day. The Dothraki in the Golden Group will be the vanguard. The Dothraki want to kill, and the Golden Group is eager for honor. They will be the first to land in Westeros. The Andal Legion and the Royal Legion will be the finale. And Rhaenys was not left behind to supervise the country this time. Because of the enemy he is about to face this time, Viserys wants to challenge the Night King. Naturally, he has to go all out. He also needed another dragon rider to fight alongside him. Daenerys was too young, so the eldest princess of the new dynasty with combat experience was naturally the first choice. White Walkers, dragons, Dothraki. In the Cathedral of St. Bela, the golden long hair reflected the light under the gloomy candlelight. A beautiful queen with a perfect figure and elegant appearance crossed her arms in front of her chest and gently bit her white teeth, muttering these words. Then she turned around and looked at the White Knight standing behind her and said with a complicated expression, "I used to think that these things were just legends, but these legendary things appeared one by one. I have seen the bones left by the giant dragons in the cellar of the Red Castle. Robert didn't like them, so he moved them underground." When talking about the scene of seeing the dragon skull for the first time, the beautiful blonde queen's face was still a little dazed. "They are too big. I can't imagine how we can defeat them. What's more, the Mad King's son has 60,000 troops, and there are Dothraki. The continent of Essos is not far away, but for a woman who has never left the Westerlands and King's Landing in her life, the Dothraki are as far away as a legend. Legend has it that these wild people eat human flesh and drink human blood, rape, and plunder, and do all kinds of evil. If she fell into the hands of the Dothraki, Cersei couldn't help but shudder slightly when she thought of this. However, these fierce Dothraki all surrendered to the Mad King's son. Can you defeat him, Sir Jaime Lannister? Defeat the dragon? Defeat the Dothraki? And the elephants of the Golden Company? What can we rely on? Father's army or those shitty golden cloaks in King's Landing? Cersei's slightly sarcastic voice sounded in the Cathedral of St. Bela. Although she was not a general, she also understood the huge gap in strength between the two sides. Before the White Walkers appeared, the nobles in the south sneered at them and didn't believe them at all. However, when the White Walkers really came and defeated the coalition forces one after another and engulfed the entire north, the nobles in the south were like frightened birds and they wanted to flee to Essos with their families for refuge. Cersei was one of them. She once thought that the White Walkers were just non-existent things, and her husband's departure from King's Landing just made it convenient for her and Jaime to have an affair. But when the White Walkers came, she was scared. That's right, Cersei, we really can't beat him. He has dragons, barbarians, and an army. On the other side, the White Knight, who was also standing in the Cathedral of St. Bela, listened to Cersei's sarcasm and was furious, and then he couldn't help but speak. But are you sure that, if we kill this old thing, we can get his forgiveness? You know, I killed his father. In the center of the Cathedral of St. Bela, just below the 7-pointed star symbol on the head, the body of a white-haired old man was lying quietly here. Chapter 383, Jon is assassinated. This morning, an earthquake-level event happened in King's Landing. For unknown reasons, the Prime Minister, the Duke of the Eyrie, Jon Arryn, who was sitting on the Iron Throne and acting as the regent, suddenly left the Prime Minister's tower and led a few guards to the top of Steel Street on Visenya Hill. Although Steel Street is not far from St. Bela's Cathedral and Silent Sister Street, it is a mixed bag with a chaotic composition of people. Although it is not as good as Flea Bottom, it is also a slum, gathering many people from the lower classes of King's Landing who make a living in the grey area, including ruffians, thieves, beggars, mercenaries, etc. Of course, there are also blacksmiths. The powerful Duke of the Vale suddenly came here with his guards, which naturally caused a commotion. The ordinary people living in Steel Street were all watching coldly, and some people with fierce faces showed malicious eyes to the old Duke, which made the accompanying Arryn family guards more vigilant. Even the Gold Cloaks dared not come here alone to cause trouble on weekdays. They would patrol in groups of 3 or 5. Every now and then, an unknown body would be abandoned in the streets. From Steel Street, it leads directly to Fisherman's Square and Mudgate, which is also the place where smugglers in King's Landing often gather. However, the Duke of the Eyrie turned a blind eye to the threatening eyes around him. He came to a blacksmith shop, tremblingly turned over and dismounted, and was about to go in. But at this time, a dozen mobs ambushed on the left and right of the blacksmith shop suddenly rushed out. They were wearing tattered clothes, but holding various weapons in their hands, and stabbed the old Duke in the chest and abdomen. Puff puff puff, a group of mobs that suddenly rushed out grabbed Jon Arryn's shoulders, and stabbed him more than a dozen times. The old Duke was completely unprepared until blood gushed out. His whole body was covered with blood, his pale beard trembled, and then he died on the spot, and his body fell in a pool of blood. The accompanying guards of the Arryn family were naturally horrified, and then they started fighting with the mobs, but they were outnumbered. These mobs were all highly skilled in martial arts, and they easily killed all the guards of the Arryn family and fled. The sudden change shocked all the people in Steel Street. Although they hated the princes and nobles, they absolutely did not dare to kill them. These people living at the bottom of the society keenly realized that something big was going to happen, so they fled in all directions. The Gold Cloaks also received the news in the shortest time. The current commander-in-chief of the capital garrison, Janos Slynt, was shocked and angry when he heard that the Prime Minister was assassinated, and then he quickly led his subordinates to catch the assassin. The atmosphere in King's Landing suddenly became tense. The news that the Prime Minister was assassinated and died spread among the nobles, and countless Gold Cloaks blocked all the streets in King's Landing to catch the escaped assassin. That night, several fierce battles broke out in King's Landing. Some assassins were found and fought to the death. They refused to surrender and were killed in the street. Other assassins surrendered or were captured alive and then imprisoned in the prison waiting for trial. However, before the night was over and the sky was not clear, these assassins died in the prison one after another. At the same time, the people of Iron Street were also in trouble. Countless grey forces hidden under the surface of King's Landing were directly turned into ashes in this big sweep. The ship gang bosses, rogue leaders, and habitual smugglers who were usually powerful and had connections with the Gold Cloaks were not let go this time. The Gold Cloaks turned their faces and were ruthless. A large number of innocent people were also arrested and interrogated in the prison to try to find clues to the murderer. But all this could not cover up the news that His Majesty's adoptive father, the Prime Minister Jonarin, was assassinated. Jonarin's body is now placed in the Cathedral of St. Bela, waiting for burial, and all the ministers of the entire royal council are silent. The queen who stayed in the Red Castle received the news and rushed to the Cathedral of St. Bela to bid farewell to the Duke of the Valley overnight. The Cathedral of St. Bela, located on the top of the Vasenia hill, was silent, with only the beautiful blonde queen and her brother, and Jonarin's body. Even if Viserys wasn't there, I would have killed him. Jaime. Hearing Jaime's question, the blonde queen in a gorgeous red velvet dress turned around, staring at her brother with a pair of green eyes, and then spoke word by word with hatred. He killed our third child. He wasn't even born yet, and he hadn't seen the world yet, but he was forced to leave because of this old thing's discovery. Cersei gritted her teeth and raised her chin, with hatred written all over her delicate cheeks. She could never let go of this matter, so she decided to kill the other party. Now is the best opportunity to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, to get revenge and gain the forgiveness of the Targaryen family, and help Viserys take over King's Landing. And he has always suspected the life experience of Joffrey and Myrcella. If he finds out that you are the biological father of Joffrey and Myrcella, Jaime, do you think Robert will let us and our children go? We will all die. We will all be strangled to death by Robert's wild boar who gets drunk every day and only knows how to make a mess in bed. Cersei spoke with resentment when she mentioned her husband. The beautiful blonde queen has the typical golden curly hair and beautiful green eyes of the Lannister family, and she has a slim figure and fair skin. Giving birth to 2 children cannot leave traces of time on her body. You know, Cersei is only 26 years old now, which is the peak age of a woman's appearance, mature, sexy, full of temptation and charm. Then seeing her brother Jaime silent, Cersei took a deep breath and calmed her emotions. Then she stretched out her white hands and held Jaime's handsome cheeks. Don't worry, Jaime. Everything is in my plan. I love you. How could I let you die? I can't live without you. The blonde queen kissed the white knight's lips gently, then looked at him closely with her eyes shining, and said in a firm voice, I will find a way to make Viserys forgive you for what you did. The worst result is to wear black clothes. What way? Your way is to wear black clothes? Hearing his sister's words, Jaime smelled the seductive fragrance on Cersei's body, and then couldn't help hugging her, and took a deep breath and questioned. Cersei, you know, I can't leave you, and I don't want to go to that shitty place. Be obedient. Cersei was touched on the buttocks by her brother's hand, but she didn't change her face. She blocked his mouth with a slender finger and whispered, don't ask too much, trust me, Jaime. I won't let you stay in that place forever. I will let you come back. Chapter 384, Callan Bay Defense Line. In the Cathedral of St. Bela, a pair of hungry men and women, under the gaze of the 7 gods, made love beside the body of the Prime Minister Jonarin. At the front of the Moat Cailin, far away from King's Landing, after 2 or 3 months, the figure of the White Walker once again appeared dimly within the detection range of the patrol sentinels. The war between humans and White Walkers is different from the war between humans and humans. Torrhen Stark, the King of Conquest, led the Northern Army to the south to participate in the encirclement and suppression of the Targaryen invaders, but he was a step late and witnessed the King and the coalition forces of the south being defeated by the dragon. Torrhen Stark knew that he could not defeat the dragon and the Targaryen army, and then knelt down and surrendered at the current location of the Kneeling Inn, in exchange for peace and tranquility in the north. The conqueror conquered the north without any effort, and without using a single soldier. It was simple and clear. But the war between humans and White Walkers is not possible. This is a contest between the living and the dead. Although the White Walkers defeated the Stark family and the coalition forces of the 7 kingdoms, no northern noble family could surrender to the White Walkers. Because surrender means death, and no one wants to die, and after death, the corpse will be manipulated by people to become disgusting whites, so the army of the dead has to sweep the castles and towns in the north one by one, which takes a lot of time. Now the generals of the 7 kingdoms have gathered here, and the famous commanders of the 7 kingdoms have gathered here, to discuss ways to repel the White Walkers. After all, this is no longer a matter of one family or one place. Some people once thought that this was a matter of the North, but in a blink of an eye, the North was destroyed, and millions of Northerners became refugees and fled to the South. If they don't unite everyone, they can only be defeated by the White Walkers one by one. Although the Bay of Kalen is easy to defend and difficult to attack, it is completely different from the difficulty of fighting from the north to the south, and from the south to the north. Under the bright lights, the slightly bald Lord Tywin was wearing crimson armor, with a bright golden lion carved on his chest, and a huge cape made of gold thread on his back. His eyes were piercing, and he pointed his finger at the map. If we place all our bets on being able to defend the Moat Kalen, then just like defending the wall and Winterfell, the final result will be a huge defeat. It is impossible for humans to defend against the attacks of the White Walkers, and they will even make the number of the opponents grow. Although it was the first time to face the White Walkers after the war, after learning the specific information, the old lion spoke bluntly without any mercy. His words made King Robert, Lord Eddard, Stannis and others present look a little unhappy, because the original battle plan was formulated by them, and they were defeated in battle after battle against the White Walkers. Your Majesty, and all the lords, since the method of defending to the death doesn't work, why don't we start from White Harbor, and cut off the White Walkers' retreat? The person who spoke was Edmure Tully, who was wearing dark green armor with a silver trout on the red and blue stripes of the family emblem. Edmure also had the Tully family's iconic long brown red hair, looking handsome and elegant, and he had many romantic affairs in the Riverlands, which made him quite popular among young girls. The young heir of Reveron has been deeply taught by Maesters since he was a child, learning about war and commanding soldiers, waiting for a good opportunity to show his skills. This time, Edmure was also sent out by his father to join the coalition to defend the safety of the Riverlands. After all, the main battlefield to face the White Walkers after the fall of the North is the Riverlands. Hoster Tully, the Duke of Reveron, is already old, and his health seems to be not very good in recent years. He is often bedridden, so he cannot go to the battlefield in person. What nonsense. A little brat who hasn't even grown all his hair yet thinks he knows how to fight after reading 2 crappy books. White Walkers don't need to eat or sleep, so what's the point of cutting off their retreat? This was Edmure's first time participating in a war, and he had no experience in facing White Walkers. This group of terrible enemies was not ordinary humans. King Robert Baratheon, who was sitting at the head of the group, was irritable for some reason, and didn't give the young heir of the Riverlands any face. Perhaps he had too many troubles recently, which made him a little restless. He didn't know that, while he was fighting in the front, his adoptive father Jon Arryn had been murdered, and his wife had cheated on him. Edmure was reprimanded by the king mercilessly, and his face suddenly became a little ugly. He swallowed his saliva, and seemed to want to say something, but he didn't have the courage to stand up. But at this time, Stannis, the Duke of Dragonstone, who was sitting next to him, suddenly spoke. It's not impossible to send a cavalry from White Harbor to cut off the White Walkers' retreat. Under the bright candlelight, the man, who was as hard as a stone, had a solemn face and a straight back. Edmure looked at Stannis gratefully, but did not receive a response from him. Stannis did not want to help Edmure out, but he did have such a plan. The dead can't ride horses. The mobility of cavalry is one of the few places where we can maintain our advantage when facing the army of the dead. White Harbor is one of the few areas in the north that has not been captured by the army of the dead. White Harbor is located at the southern end of the north at the mouth of the White Knife River, and is the most important trading port in the north. Because it is backed by the sea, it is convenient to transport supplies and soldiers. Facing enemies on land, it can attack or defend. Therefore, many coalition soldiers stationed in White Harbor formed a line of defense with Kalen Bay. Stannis proposed to send a team of cavalry to harass behind the enemy, to attract the attention of the army of the dead. Lead these dead troops who were led away to run as far north as possible to reduce the pressure on the defense line of Kalen Bay. However, this is a mission with no chance of survival. After Stannis finished speaking, there was silence in the meeting room, and no one spoke to express their opinions. Then, Tywin Lannister's green eyes swept across the map. Then he looked up at his gloomy son-in-law, tapped his fingers lightly on the table, and after a long while, He spoke in a low and powerful voice. "We need dragons, your majesty." When I led my troops past the beauty set, I heard a saying that seemed to be spread by a red-robed witch from Essos. She said that the enemy we are facing now is actually not prepared for us at all. Only the dragon can defeat the Night King. The words of the Warden of the West made Robert's face look a little ugly, but Tywin's eyes did not stop, but continued to ask in a deep voice, "Your Majesty, I remember that we have asked for help from the remnants of the Targaryen. What was the result?" If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 385, Attack on White Harbor. In Tywin's creed, there are no eternal enemies, only eternal interests. He can bow his head for the immediate interests, and even endure humiliation, but the one who laughs last will win. The pre-war meeting is over. Lord Tywin returned to the camp of the Westerland soldiers under the escort of the Lannister soldiers. Flags representing various families in the Westerlands are flying over the camp. My lord. My lord. The soldiers patrolling along the way saluted when they saw Lord Tywin, but Tywin's face was as cold as frost, and he didn't even respond. Jonah, Kevin, Gillian. Although the Targaryen family was mentioned in the pre-war meeting, few people knew that Tywin's resentment for the Targaryen family would be even deeper. The two are incompatible, and only the complete destruction of one side can end it. However, it's a pity that Tywin, who is deep-minded, doesn't know what his two good children, who he is proud of, have done in King's Landing. After all, the news of Jon Arryn's death has not been reported back, and the next day, with the morning mist, the defenders on the walls of White Harbor yawned slightly. They had the coat of arms of the Vale families on their chests, and the green flags fluttered in the wind. They were soldiers of the Vale, led by the Earl of Runestone City, Bronze John. They were now stationed in White Harbor to defend against the attacks of the White Walkers, guard this outlet to the sea, and also relieve the pressure on the front line of defense. "Peak, do you think we can survive this winter?" a Vale soldier said worriedly. After experiencing two whiteouts, the morale of the coalition forces has fallen to the bottom, and the whole army is full of pessimism. After the failure of the first decisive battle at the wall, the morale of the coalition forces was still high, and they were determined to fight back in Winterfell. However, the Battle of Winterfell once again suffered a heavy blow in a head-on confrontation, which completely defeated the confidence of the coalition soldiers and generals. Not only ordinary soldiers, but even many generals and nobles were very pessimistic, as if the end of the world was tomorrow. Morale is like this. It is vigorous at first, but weak at second, and exhausted at third. Successive failures will not inspire the fighting spirit of soldiers, but will make them run all the way to the abyss. This is why there are so few cases of GD counterattacks since ancient times. I don't know. Humph, maybe today or tomorrow, we will die. Another soldier named Peck, whose fingers were frozen red while holding a spear, exhaled white air from his mouth and shook his head and said, "Let's die. If we die, there will be no more suffering to endure. This world is hopeless." 7 gods? I finally understand that the damn 7 gods are useless. We are the 7th level of hell here. Praying was useless before. The monk told me that it was because I was not pious enough. I was pious by paying a little money. Now the world is about to be destroyed, and the 7 gods have not yet appeared. Under extreme pessimism, the worldview that people used to have collapsed. Peck, a soldier in the valley, kept cursing the 7 gods that he once believed in. "Hush, keep your voice down." At this time, a carriage with a mermaid emblem drove over not far away. The companion beside him poked Peak and reminded him to keep his voice down. Old Lord Manderley is here. Although the faith of the 7 gods has collapsed, even if the soldiers keep cursing, the 7 gods pretend not to hear like a turtle. But those who believe in the 7 gods can hear it and punish him. Although death is death sooner or later, Peak does not want to be beheaded by old Lord Manderley. The Lord of White Harbor is the Manderley family, a former family of the River Reach, but because of its excessive expansion of power, it was vigilant by the King of the River Reach. Then it was expelled from the River Reach Kingdom 1,000 years before the conquest, and exiled to the north, and was accepted by the king of the north at that time. The Mandalay family swore in the name of the new and old gods under the heart tree of the Wolf's Lair, loyal to the Stark family, and the king of the north granted them fiefdoms. This favor became the source of the Mandalay family's loyalty to the Stark family. The Mandalay family built a city called White Harbor with their own wealth. The one who climbed down from the carriage with difficulty was the current Earl of White Harbor, Wyman Mandalay. He was very old, in his 50s and almost 60 years old. And he was fat, and could only travel in a sedan chair. His loud and hearty laughter was nicknamed Lord Lord who can't ride a horse by the people under his rule. However, old Mandalay had a good temper, and was not angry after hearing it. Instead, he laughed and laughed it off. And Earl Wyman Mandalay climbed up the wall of White Harbor with the help of the guards to inspect. He naturally did not hear the rebellious remarks of the Veil soldiers just now, and even patted Peak on the shoulder to encourage him. The Veil soldiers were terrified, and didn't even know what to say. The figure of the old Earl Mandalay gradually faded away with the help of the guards, and just when the Veil soldiers breathed a sigh of relief, another companion beside him looked at the avenue in the distance, covered by white snow and fog, and suddenly said, "Look. What is that?" A shadowy black figure first appeared in the white snow, but at this moment, an ice arrow penetrated the snow at a very fast speed and hit the eagle flag next to the Valley Soldier Peak. Crash! The flag of the Arin family collapsed, and Peak, who had just spoken nonsense to the 7 gods, was also shocked. Fuck. He even thought he was going to die at that moment. However, he took 2 steps back in panic, but he didn't notice that there was too much snow on the wall and his feet slipped a little. Then he lost his footing and fell directly from the wall, landing headfirst on the ground. Bang! Like a rucksack falling down, the body lay on the ground, and blood quickly spread in the white snow. However, no one cared about his death at this moment. The Valley soldiers and White Harbor soldiers on the walls of White Harbor were in chaos. "White walkers are coming! White walkers are coming!" The soldiers shouted a warning, and blew the warning horn at the same time. Woo! In an instant, the desolate horn that shook the eardrums resounded through the clouds, and the 7 Kingdoms coalition stationed in White Harbor heard the horn and swarmed out. The endless army of the dead gradually appeared in people's sight. Everyone swallowed and clenched their weapons. The old Earl Mandalay, who was fat and needed to be supported, was panting, but he was also fearless. He held the battlement with his hand and looked at the army of the dead in the distance. He had been waiting for this day for a long time. However, when the army of the dead got closer and closer, he saw the 2 white walkers in the front, and his pupils suddenly shrank. The fat palm holding the battlement squeezed a handful of cold snowflakes, which instantly soaked his heart. This is Chapter 386 Unbelievable News. Kill. The earth-shaking shouts of killing gradually died down. Flames shot up into the sky, and thick smoke drifted in this magnificent port city standing at the mouth of the White Blade River. Darkness will not last long, and light will surely come. I hope that future generations will remember our names. Accompanied by a tragic and loud roar. Plop, plop, one by one, the coalition soldiers wearing tattered family armor shouted their names loudly to the sea with tears in their eyes, hoping that the sea would remember them, and then jumped into the cold sea water to die calmly. As another major stronghold of the coalition's defense line, White Harbor was the first to encounter a fierce attack by the White Walkers. The coalition forces and the Mandalay family soldiers stationed in White Harbor did not surrender, but fought back to resist the attack of the army of the dead. But in the end, they had no choice but to try their best, but still could not resist the surging army of the dead. After the coalition soldiers persisted for several days without waiting for the arrival of reinforcement, White Harbor finally fell. Due to the insufficient number of warships and limited carrying capacity, a large number of coalition soldiers chose to fight to the death, and were eventually forced to jump into the sea. They would rather drown in the cold sea than turn into whites and continue to harm their compatriots. This epic and tragic story is only a small part of the humans' tenacious resistance to the White Walkers, and was later widely sung by bards. However, the fall of White Harbor is not the end of the world, and humans still have hope in the third line of defense. A few days later, on the eve of the fall of White Harbor, the old Earl Wyman Mandalay, who escaped from White Harbor by boat, finally led the remnants of his defeated army to the front line of Kalin Bay, and his family had been sent to King's Landing. He brought an incredible news. Old Elmanderly, Lord Eel, claimed to have seen his former lord, the Duke of Winterfell, Rickard Stark, the previous generation of the Northern Guardian, and his eldest son Brandon Stark on the battlefield of White Harbor. They have turned into White Walkers, with ice blue flames burning in their eyes. Lord Rickard seems to still be wearing the armor he wore when he was burned alive by the Mad King, but it has been covered with a layer of ice. Brandon was the first to climb the top of White Harbor. No soldier could stop him, and he killed my eldest son, Wallace, with one sword. The soldiers on the battlefield of White Harbor resisted tenaciously and blocked the army of the dead for 3 days. Then the White Walkers behind them took action, and the resistance of the coalition soldiers also vanished. The fierce street fighting lasted for several days, and in the end, before the arrival of reinforcement from the headquarters in Moat Cailin, the coalition troops stationed in White Harbor were completely wiped out except for those who boarded the warships and escaped. The news brought by Lord Eel was very shocking, but not many people believed it, especially Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, who had suffered a series of blows and was only middle-aged, but his hair was already a little grey. He seemed to have aged a lot overnight. He was unwilling to believe that his father and brother had turned into White Walkers. But the old Earl Manderly was an old minister during his father's time, and he was very old. He was friendly, and had many friends. No one believed that the old Earl Manderly would maliciously satirize a Stark family. Eddard only thought that the old man was confused, or perhaps he was frightened by the situation at that time, and saw some illusions. After all, according to the guards, the old man was almost killed by the White Walkers at that time, and witnessed the death of his eldest son Willis with his own eyes. He was greatly shocked, and was forcibly taken down by the guards. However, the guards who witnessed it with their own eyes, could not say clearly whether the two White Walkers were Rickard Stark and Brandon Stark, because they had not seen these two adults, so the matter was left unresolved. However, it was not long after the news of the fall of White Harbor came back. The front line of the Bay of Kalin. The army of the dead finally arrived late, and they swept away all the obstacles in the north, leaving only the death and cold to the whole Westeros and even the world through the neck. Moat Cailin was built by the ancestors as early as 10,000 years ago. At that time, it was a magnificent fortress with 20 towers and basalt walls as high as Winterfell. It was once the key to defending the north, and resolved countless attacks by the Andals. However, now most of the tall walls have disappeared, and the wooden towers have rotted 1,000 years ago. Only 3 of the 20 towers are left. However, after the coalition retreated to Moat Cailin, they gathered all their strength and renovated the abandoned ancient castle, just like they repaired the Wall of Despair. 20 towers stood in front of the neck, and on the King's Road in the distance, the endless figures of the army of the dead gradually emerged. The crowds of people were so crowded that they could not see the end at a glance. The throats of the 7 coalition forces on the wall rolled together. Although many of them were survivors of 1 or 2 wars, they still felt their scalps tingling. Among the coalition forces, there are more recruits who have never seen the White Walkers. They are all newly sent southern soldiers to support the Bay of Kalin, and many of them are just captured. During the Great Escape from the north, millions of people crossed the neck and fled to the south. These people were also homeless and had no livelihood in the south. They could only rely on the relief of nobles from all over the country, otherwise they would freeze to death or starve to death. The strong and healthy even began to plunder villages and towns in order to bring back some food for their families. The nobles in the Riverlands were troubled by this, because these refugees were mainly concentrated in their territory, and they could only pay money and food to feed them, otherwise it would cause greater chaos. During the Great Escape, the ruling class of the feudal dynasty only wanted to encourage the people to flee to the south. Their original intention might be good. They did not want the people to die at the hands of the White Walkers, and they did not want to give blood transfusions to the White Walkers. Otherwise, after the complete fall of the north, millions of dead legions would flock to the south, and even the advent of the 7 gods would not be able to stop them. However, they only encouraged the people to flee, but did not figure out how to resettle these people. The weakness of grassroots governance was exposed, resulting in the current chaotic situation. Fortunately, now is the time to use people, and King Robert has his own way of governing the country. With a wave of his hand, he first continued to lend money to the Iron Bank, asking for gold dragons and food. Now Westeros has completely become a den of evil, and Bravos may not be able to escape. Then he spent a lot of money to recruit a large number of people in the north into the army. These people did not need to be paid, but only needed to be given a meal. The number of the coalition forces expanded rapidly at this time to more than 100,000 people. However, the subsequent problem was the lack of armor and weapons, but there was no way, so they could only bite the bullet. The number of the coalition forces reached an unprecedented number, and they were united in fighting against the White Walkers. Chapter 5 was written after get off work in the evening. Chapter 387 Secret Weapon. But the exaggerated number of the coalition forces of more than 100,000 was still not enough when facing the army of the dead. Now the commanders of the coalition forces were not sure how many whites there were, but it was definitely not 200,000 or 300,000, 500,000 or 600,000, or millions. The most terrifying thing about the army of the dead was its transformation ability. Countless dead people got up again and became their people. The number of their own people became fewer and fewer, while the number of the enemy became more and more. How to fight this battle? The famous commanders of the Seven Kingdoms gathered here, but no one knew how to fight such a monster, so they could only take it one step at a time. Then the White Walkers began to attack the city. The endless army of whites let out a terrifying howl and rushed to the walls of the Bay of Kalin. The soldiers on the walls of Bay Kalin also began to raise their bows and arrows. There was a blazing bonfire every few steps on the White Wall Road. The soldiers first touched the arrows stained with kerosene to the flames, lit the bows and arrows, and then put them on the bowstrings. Then, following the commander's orders, they all raised their bows and arrows. Raise your bows. Release. Bang, bang, bang. Arrows burning with flames flew into the sky, and then formed a rain of fire and fell down. The whites can completely ignore the arrows, but are extremely afraid of the flames burning on the arrows. This is also the experience that humans have gradually summed up when facing the White Walkers. Humans are a race that is good at learning and changing. There are too many whites swarming in. The archers on the walls of Bay Kalin don't need to aim at all. They just need to light the arrows and then close their eyes and shoot them. Puff, puff, puff. Burning arrows fell into the endless group of whites. Roar. The whites that were shot by arrows cried out and fell to the ground in the snow, but before they could get up again, they were trampled into pieces by the whites that rushed up from behind. The whites had no emotions, only madness for flesh and blood, and the whites that were trampled did not feel any pain, but their heads were flattened while howling. Duke Tywin's face was ugly, his palm tightly grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist, standing on the tower of the city wall, his green eyes constantly scanning the entire battlefield. This was the first time he saw the White Walkers. He was once a little curious about how terrible the monsters that could defeat the coalition forces one after another and even cause the entire north to fall were. However, the first time he saw it, he left a deep impression on him. If these monsters are not completely defeated, Westeros will be finished. Such an idea suddenly flashed through Tywin's mind. At that time, no conspiracy or Game of Thrones would work. The Seven Kingdoms, dire elves, trout, lions, deer, roses and other noble and ancient families have all become zombies, and Westeros is full of such monsters. Just thinking about it, Tywin even felt a little cold in his hands and feet, and he wanted to retreat. However, the old lion was very cunning after all, and his emotions were not expressed on his face. He was still as steady as a mountain, which made Tyrion, who had been secretly observing his father's face for a long time, admire him. "Father, you are worthy of being a father." This time, the little devil also followed his father to Kalin Bay. Although he was 19 years old, his height was still like a child. As a natural dwarf, his existence has always been a shame for the Lannister family. His father even asked him to supervise the construction of the drainage system of Casterly Rock to humiliate him. But he didn't expect that this time, when he went to Kalin Bay to face the White Walkers, all the prominent nobles in the Seven Kingdoms would gather here, and his father was willing to take him with him, which moved Tyrion very much. In the past, his father would regard him as a shame and would never let him attend such occasions with many nobles. Did his father finally stop looking down on him? Tyrion didn't think much about it. Then he turned back and continued to concentrate on the battlefield ahead. The war did not seem to be going well. The coalition's fire attack had a certain degree of effect, but there was still the same problem. There were too many whites, and they were not afraid of death. Without large-scale lethal weapons, it was impossible to stop them from advancing. Now the fast-running whites had rushed to the wall of the Bay of Kalin. The soldiers threw kerosene down and ignited it to form a wall of fire to block the whites. But this is not a long-term solution after all. We need other ways to defeat the White Walkers. Tyrion was wearing a tailor-made suit with the Lannister family emblem on his chest. His brain was turning rapidly, thinking about countermeasures. Although he was short and ugly and was called Little Devil, Tyrion's brain was actually very smart. Because he was rejected and hated by his companions, Tyrion liked to hide in a corner and read books alone since he was a child. His only friend was his brother Jaime. At this time, there was a sudden commotion below. For some reason, a white stepped on the corpse of its companion and crossed the sea of fire and suddenly climbed up the city wall and directly knocked a Lannister soldier to the ground. The Lannister soldiers next to him were horrified and then drew their swords to cut the white into pieces, but the soldier who was knocked down still lost his life, and half of his throat was bitten off, and blood was spilled all over the ground. Several soldiers followed the commander's order and threw the body of their companion off the city wall and into the sea of fire for cremation. Tyrion looked a little uncomfortable when he saw this bloody scene. This was his first time to experience war in person. Then he turned his head and looked at his father again, and Duke Tywin still looked calm and looked as steady as a mountain, but the fingers holding the hilt of the sword were slightly white. Seeing his father's calm expression, Tyrion felt much more relieved. The White Walkers are indeed terrible, but as a noble member of the Lannister family, Tyrion believes that his safety is still very guaranteed, not to mention that his father is still by his side. Father won't hurt himself. It's like praising the tragic story of the White Harbor soldiers jumping into the sea to commit suicide, but no one mentioned that the Earl of White Harbor boarded a ship and escaped one step ahead. And as the nominally powerful heir to the West, Tyrion also knew that, in order to fight against the White Walkers this time, the princes and nobles of the Seven Kingdoms seemed to have prepared a powerful secret weapon. It had been secretly transported to the Moat Kalin a long time ago. The carriages transporting these secret weapons only traveled at night and were tightly covered and light-proof. They were even filled with sand. After the goods arrived at the storage cellar, they were sealed with wax honey and stored in water. With such a secret weapon, the coalition may be able to defeat the White Walkers in one fell swoop in the neck. Tyrion thought secretly in his heart. Chapter 388 Tyrion's Despair. The walls of the Bay of Kalin are tall and easy to defend, but difficult to attack. The army of the dead was frustrated in the process of attacking the Bay of Kalin, and the commanders and soldiers of the coalition forces had sufficient experience in dealing with the whites, and they seemed to be more handy. Crash. Barrels of kerosene that were continuously transported from the Seven Kingdoms and even the continent of Essos were poured down, as if they were free of charge, and the raging flames continued to burn. The whites rushed in one after another, and were buried in the sea of fire. Whoosh, the flames illuminated the entire sky, and the billowing smoke rushed straight into the sky. It could even be seen on the sea surface of the Bay of Biting, which was far away from the Bay of Kalin. The burnt dust and stench floated in the wind. The coalition forces of the Seven Kingdoms played a heroic role in the Bay of Kalin, and they resisted tenaciously with all their will, and temporarily stopped the White Walkers from advancing. However, the good times did not last long. 2 days and 1 night of fierce war passed, and the war between the living and the dead was a white-hot situation every minute, without the slightest chance to breathe. Can't retreat. Can't retreat. Hold your ground. The famous general of the River Reach, Randyll Tarly, shouted hoarsely, his body covered in blood. He had been withdrawn 3 times, and he had only rested for 2 hours and 2 days and 1 night. Lord Hornhill held his sword and just leaned against the wall of the Bay of Kalin, squinting slightly. Now his eyes were full of bloodshot, but he still led the way, and was on the front line with his soldiers. Quick, the 3rd echelon retreated to rest, and the 4th echelon took over. Then Randall Tully panted, looked at the battle in front of him and remained calm, and then shouted loudly. Facing the continuous attack of the whites, the third echelon, which was about to collapse, got a chance to breathe. The fourth echelon, which was rotated out not long ago, suffered serious casualties, but still took the lead without hesitation. The coalition's shaky front line was stabilized. Kill. The fighting on the battlefield was still fierce. 2 days and 1 night had passed. Although all the coalition soldiers had several echelons constantly rotating and had some time to eat and drink, they could not hold on any longer. After all, this was a highly tense battlefield and they could lose their lives if they were not careful. All the coalition soldiers had red eyes and dense bloodshot eyes. After being replaced from the front line, they did not even have time to find a place, but just fell asleep in a random place. However, even if they were sleeping soundly, they still held their weapons tightly without any relaxation. Even busier were the military doctors. They were also busy all the time. A large number of injured soldiers who could not get treatment were carried off the battlefield and died. Their bodies still needed to be cremated to prevent them from suddenly getting up and becoming new White Walkers. After 2 days and 1 night of fierce fighting, it was not just ordinary soldiers, but also a severe torment for the coalition forces, including King Robert and all the princes and nobles. The soldiers of the coalition are living people. They need to sleep, rest, and eat. They also need hope, encouragement, and comfort on the spiritual level. Now they are all supported by a spirit. But the army of the dead does not need it. They are like beasts without emotions. They do not need to rest, do not know fatigue, and do not need to eat. They are constantly and madly attacking the third line of defense of the 7-nation coalition in the Bay of Kalin. Such a war is a war of decline and gain. If the opponent cannot be consumed, the coalition will eventually fall. The coalition has performed very well in this war. The 2 previous wars did not even last for a day and a night, and the coalition's front was already defeated. The Battle of the Bay of Kalin is different from the Battle of White Harbor. This is a collision between the main forces of both sides. The soldiers of the coalition persisted for a long time in the Battle of White Harbor because the army of the dead did not invest too many troops and did not crush the resistance of the coalition soldiers. However, as Duke Tywin said in the pre-war meeting, it is impossible to defeat the enemy by holding the position in the face of an enemy like the White Walkers. It is necessary to give full play to the advantages of human IQ and win by surprise. The biggest advantage of humans against the White Walkers is not cavalry, but brains. The dead have no brains, and even though the White Walkers are monsters with brains, there are only a few White Walkers, while humans have many generals. Then the coalition soldiers persevered for another night, until the 3rd day after the war, when the sky was dawning, and the sky was pale. King Robert, the commander-in-chief of the coalition, finally issued an order to retreat. This time it was not the collapse of the coalition front, but the king took the initiative to issue an order to retreat. The defeat was like a mountain collapsing, as if the last breath of air weighing on the hearts of the coalition soldiers had been relaxed. The method adopted by the coalition was still to set fire to the rear. All the kerosene stored in the Bay of Kalin was ignited in one breath, and the raging fire rushed straight to the sky. The ancient castle that had existed for 10,000 years was tottering in the flames until finally a wailing sound was heard and the Bay of Kalin collapsed. The soldiers of the coalition gathered on the causeway of the neck and retreated to the rear. Many of them were even pushed off the causeway and fell into the rotten mire with a foul smell, but no one was willing to help. The third line of defense of the Seven Kingdoms coalition was the entire neck. Kalin Bay was easy to defend and difficult to attack due to geographical reasons, but it was also impossible to stockpile too many soldiers. There were still a large number of coalition soldiers in the rear south of the neck. Therefore, giving up Kalin Bay did not mean giving up the entire neck and being defeated. The coalition formed an alliance with the Marshlanders living in the neck. The Reed family of Greywater Watch had a close personal relationship with the Stark family. Howland Reed, the patriarch of the Reed family, was the leader of the Marshlanders. He was willing to help train the soldiers of the coalition to survive in the marshland, lead them to be familiar with the complex narrow roads and waterways in the reeds, and use the natural barrier of the neck to unite and fight against the existence of the White Walkers. The coalition soldiers retreated in a hurry after the war, and the kings and nobles of the Seven Kingdoms left Caelin Bay first. Carriages of all sizes, nobles in military uniforms ran in the front. However, Tyrion, the heir to the west, did not enjoy such treatment. He followed his father to the battlefield with joy, and even met the king and many dukes. But he never expected that his father would abandon him on the battlefield at this time. No, I was not abandoned on the battlefield, but my father wanted me to die. Tyrion's hands and feet were tied with chains, lying deep in the cellar of the Bay of Caelin. His small body kept struggling, feeling the increasingly hot temperature above his head, and the howling of the whites was clearly audible. On his ugly cheeks, a pair of eyes revealed deep despair. Chapter 389 Big Explosion. All the kerosene stored in the Bay of Caelin was ignited to cover the rear, and a huge fire that shot up into the sky blocked the advance of the army of whites. The soldiers of the Seven Kingdoms coalition were defeated in a panic, and behind the army of the dead, hundreds of skeleton horses stood quietly, including mammoths, dire elves, etc. On the backs of these mounts sat indifferent white walkers wearing ice armor. In stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of the battlefield in the distance, it was quiet here, so quiet that you could hear a needle drop, and even the sound of breathing did not exist, only the sound of wind and snow whistling in your ears. The next swamp is located at the southernmost end of the north. Normally, this scale of blizzards rarely fall here, but with the footsteps of the Night King, cold and death also came in an instant. The number of white walkers has increased several times compared to when the Night King just came out of the mountain. Most of them are ancestors of the Stark family, countless generations of kings and guardians of the north. Some of them have been transformed successfully, and some have failed. Their bodies were reduced to skeletons, or even a handful of dirt, but they were revived under the magic of the Night King, and they pulled out the long swords on the stone statues in front of their tombs, and roared like the cracking of ice. The Night King seemed to have a special liking for the family of the King of Winter, or there was something special about the blood of the ancient Stark family. When the Night King first saw Eddard, he wanted to kill him personally, and all the newly born White Walkers also came from the Stark family. The blood of the Stark family was like a bright light in the dark night, guiding the direction of the Night King at all times. In the silent area, there was only the sound of the whistling wind and snow. Then the Night King pulled out the ice sword at his waist, and made a sound like the cracking of ice, and then took the lead, in urging the skeleton horse to walk slowly towards the distant Caelin Bay, which was burning with raging fire. Roar, the whites were afraid of fire. The fire in the Bay of Caelin stopped the advance of countless whites. However, when the Night King led many white walkers to the army of the dead, all the whites shut up and stopped making harsh roars. They even took the initiative to make way for them. The sound of the skeleton horse's hooves was clear, and the sound of the flames was crackling. The army of the dead, which was noisy just now, suddenly became silent, as if it was under orders. All the whites were watching the figure of the Night King until he came to the blazing fire and gently pulled the reins. The Night King, wearing the ice crown, had ice blue flames in his eyes. He stared at the fire in front of him without saying a word, then raised his hand and pressed it down gently. Crack, crack, crack. A layer of white ice quickly condensed from the ground under the Night King and spread quickly towards the fire not far away. The surging flames just now encountered this thin layer of ice and only shook a few times before being extinguished in an instant. Then the ice continued to spread. Not long after, a road of ice was opened up in the sea of fire, leading directly to the causeway behind the distant Caelin Bay. However, the Night King looked at the scene in front of him with no joy or sadness in his eyes. The flames in his eye sockets beat steadily, and then he urged the skeleton horse under his crotch to take the lead in stepping onto this road of ice opened up in the sea of fire. The hundreds of white walkers following behind the Night King, including the ancestors of the King of Winter's family, said nothing, with indifferent faces, urging the skeleton war horses to follow the Night King and step onto this road of ice. The Night King walked in front, and the white walkers followed behind him, while countless whites silently followed the footsteps of the white walkers, stepped onto the road of ice, and gathered in a black mass through the sea of fire in Caelin Bay. On the way through the fire of Bay Caelin, the Night King looked down at the ground under his feet. He noticed that there seemed to be a living person surviving in the underground cellar. However, a mere living person was not worth his personal effort. Then the Night King raised his head again and continued to move forward slowly towards the distance. His steps were very slow, but as he took a step forward, the wind and snow followed him forward, and a warm wind from the south took a step back at the same time. It was not that the Night King deliberately let the coalition soldiers escape and did not know how to pursue the victory, but in a field that mortals could not see or touch, this was a contest between light and darkness, warmth and cold. No one knew how much terrible pressure the Night King had to bear every step forward. Therefore, his steps were extremely slow, and it seemed that he was not in a hurry. The army of the dead must wait until the cold completely enveloped the north and dispelled all the warmth before continuing to move forward. However, this gave the coalition soldiers a chance to escape. The Night King's footsteps continued to move forward, and the army of the dead followed him silently and continued to pass through the fire of Baikalin. In the distance, the leaders of the Seven Kingdoms, King Robert Baratheon, and many dukes were running in the front, but they all looked nervous at the moment, constantly whispering to each other, and even turned their heads frequently to look behind, as if they were afraid that the White Walkers would suddenly catch up with them. However, in fact, they were expecting something. This was a plan that the coalition had been planning for a long time. They did not use it until the fall of the Bay of Kalin, because they did not want the White Walkers to be prepared and achieve a surprise victory. The leaders of the Seven Kingdoms have also seen that the Night King is the key to defeating the army of the dead. Only by killing him can the White Walkers be truly defeated. Therefore, all their preparations are to kill the Night King. Tywin, the Duke of Casterly Rock, the Guardian of the West, was also in the order of retreat. Unlike the king and the dukes, Duke Tywin did not look back even once while riding on horseback. He just held the reins without saying a word and kept moving forward in silence. No one asked Tywin about Tyrion's whereabouts. Perhaps a poor dwarf would not be cared for by anyone under any circumstances. Did Tyrion die on the battlefield if he did not retreat in time? Who cares? Maybe because they are too small, they didn't get on the carriage. In the distance, the Night King's horse finally stepped onto the White Causeway. The thick silt on both sides of the causeway was covered with a thin layer of ice. The kings of the north rode on skeleton horses and silently stepped into the mud of the next swamp. However, they did not sink deep into it. Instead, they walked on flat ground. The footsteps of the whites kept following. And below the causeway, several coalition soldiers who were determined to die looked at the densely packed dark green jars around them, looked at each other, and then lit torches and smashed a green jar. In an instant, an earthquake broke out. Boom. The green flames that soared into the sky illuminated the entire sky, and the huge roar made the earth tremble. Chapter 390 Plan failed. The allied soldiers who had already fled far ahead were panicking, not knowing what disaster had happened. The high-ranking nobles of the Seven Kingdoms reined in their horses, looked behind them nervously, and whispered to each other. King Robert sat on his horse with his round body, his armor almost stretched out by his belly, holding his warhammer in one hand, and the guards of the Red Keep protected him on both sides, as well as the kings good Ser Mandan Moore and Ser Meryn Trent. Whoa. Then King Robert reined in his horse, and turned his head to look into the distance, his fat face full of frost and fatigue, and his black beard fluttered slightly in the wind. More than half a year of continuous defeats has put him under tremendous psychological pressure, and his voice is low and faintly full of expectation. Did they blow him to death? The sudden explosion was heard even farther away, and the green flames and rolling airwaves produced by the explosion rushed straight into the sky, tearing through the dark clouds above, forming a green mushroom cloud that illuminated everyone's cheeks. There were fear, surprise, indifference, and expectation on these faces. All the people in the coalition army were in a state of dismay. Tywin Lannister did not have any expression of joy on his face. The Duke of Casterly Rock looked indifferent, and his hands were tightly holding the reins. But under the observation of Stafford Lannister, he seemed to be able to faintly feel his cousin's complex emotions, which were relieved and guilty. The two were intertwined, and it was difficult to tell which emotion prevailed. Not long ago, it was Sir Stafford and several knights of the Lannister family who personally carried out their cousin's orders. They tied Tyrion to the wall of the cellar with chains, hoping that this freak who brought shame to the Lannister family would die in the hands of the White Walkers, and at the same time, earn some reputations of fighting bravely, and make the best use of it. Tywin looked at the mushroom cloud rising from the explosion in silence for a long time, and then finally retracted his gaze. The expression on his face still did not show joy or anger, and then he clamped his legs, and squeezed the horse's belly and said calmly, "Let's go." After hearing his cousin's words, Stafford hurriedly urged his warhorse to retreat with the Lannister family soldiers along the causeway. Whether the Night King was killed or not, the coalition forces did not know. However, no one wanted to go back in this situation. The coalition forces invested a lot of wildfire for this war. This is a flammable liquid that can burn for a long time. It is made by the Alchemist Guild. The power of each can of explosion is amazing. No matter what kind of object is ignited by wildfire, it will burn out. It can penetrate clothes, wood, leather and even steel, and can make it burn. Even this weird green liquid can burn when floating on the water. Viserys' father, Mad King Aerys II, used to like to burn people with wildfire. Because of the unique characteristics of wildfire, it will not go out for a long time after the explosion, especially since the coalition forces have devoted all their national strength. With such a terrifying explosion equivalent, ordinary people can't get close to the core area of the explosion. Maybe they will be melted before they get close, and there is no way to know whether the Night King is dead or alive. Therefore, when this plan was formulated, it was already determined, and there was no need to look back, no matter what the result was. The coalition forces retreated all the way to the base camp of the twins. The coalition forces detonated a large amount of wildfire stored under the causeway and fled. At the center of the wildfire explosion, the green flames that shot up into the sky turned into a mushroom cloud and then gradually dissipated. With the center of the explosion under the feet of the Night King as the center, several kilometers in radius had been razed to the ground, and the King's Road, the only passage connecting the north and the south, was blown to pieces and completely destroyed. The traditional animals and plants growing in the neck swamp, lizard lions, venomous snakes, dense forests soaked in silt all year round, fungi hanging like curtains between branches, etc., all turned into ashes. Everywhere you look, there are green flames burning everywhere, making crackling sounds, as if it has turned into a terrifying purgatory on Earth. And the countless armies of whites following the Night King, tens of thousands or even more, were annihilated in the moment of the explosion. And there are more who were ignited by the splashing wildfire, fell to the ground with crazy howls, and were burned to ashes. These whites have died permanently, and will never get up again. They have become part of the nutrients of the earth. However, at this time, in the center of the wildfire explosion, kakaka, a strange sound of ice cracking spread from the center of the explosion, and soon expanded rapidly. The white snow and wind still echoed with the green flames. The coalition's battle plan failed. The large amount of wildfire buried underground did not directly blow the Night King into the sky. Although the bodies of the white ghosts were torn by the shock wave of the explosion, ordinary fire could not burn their souls, so they soon recovered under the power of the wind and snow. A large number of whites were blown to ashes, but for the army of the dead, whites are the most indispensable thing, so the pace of the army of the white ghosts was only slightly blocked, and then they continued their journey to the south. The cold covered the entire neck, and the army of whites walked through the neck, which was known as a natural barrier, as if it were flat ground. The Night King did not regard humans as enemies, but his biggest enemy was the warm wind blowing from the south. The blood of the King of the North seemed to contain some ancient and mysterious unknown power, which belonged to the cold and the wind and snow. The Night King revived the King of the North of the Stark family for generations, and with their help, the Night King seemed to have become more proficient in the power of cold. In the confrontation between the red and the blue, that mortals could not touch, the blue light gradually squeezed the red light. And the reality reflected in the mortal eyes was that the cold wind of winter continued to blow in the south, sweeping in with the footsteps of the Night King. Humanity is defeated. The old Lord Freeland on a cane. The years made his hair worn out, his teeth lost, and his skin loose, but his age of nearly 90 still brought him experience that ordinary people could not achieve. His voice was harsh but still loud. He looked energetic and even often boasted that he was as strong as a bull and could still have sex and reproduce. How many years has it been since the green fork was frozen? Huh. The last time it didn't freeze in the winter was before the false spring. Old Lord Walder Free laughed, seemingly not worried about the current predicament. In the false spring, Rhaegar took Lyanna away, sparking a war and eventually losing the throne of the Targaryen family. Chapter 391 Dragon Roars to the Sky. I remember that the last time the green fork froze was when I was still a young man. That should be more than 60 years ago. After a long summer of 7 years, there was a short autumn, and then a cold winter of 6 years. The green fork froze at that time. People froze to death at that time. Old Lord Free waved his hand, as if he was sighing about the past. But then Old Lord Free stopped his hand stiffly, and slowly put it back on his crutches. He looked at the green fork, which was gradually no longer flowing, and a layer of ice condensed under the wind and snow. His dim old eyes were a little absent-minded. He had been looking at this river for almost 90 years. The Free family had also been revitalized in his hands. The family power was strengthened, and no one could be underestimated. The population was prosperous, but all this was a natural disaster. The result of all this prosperity was no match for a natural disaster. The rushing green fork finally stopped flowing. There was no one beside old Walder Free. It turned out that he had been talking to himself just now. The disaster is here. After the White Walkers pass through the neck, the first place they will attack is the twins. The twins' status in the Riverlands is like that of the Bay of Kalin in the north. Facing the enemies from the south, the north can be safe by guarding the Bay of Kalin, and facing the places coming from the north, as long as the lords of the Riverlands can defend the twins, the problem can be solved to a large extent. The Free family is prosperous, but the dead and the wounded have all been sent out at this moment. Only old Free himself is left in the twins, and the descendants who are worried about him have been sent to the continent of as a spy ship. Old Free is experienced, and has realized the danger in advance, and made plans to leave a little fire for the Free family. Even if he wants to leave, his body, which he boasts of being strong and healthy, cannot support him to cross the ocean. He is afraid that he will die at sea, so he also gave up this idea. More than a month has passed since the Battle of Bay of Kalin. The coalition's plan to kill the Night King with wildfire failed. Although a large number of ordinary whites were killed, the Night King was not hurt at all. The coalition's next tactic, the Reed family of Grey Water Watch, also failed to deal with the army of White Walkers in the neck. The elusive coalition soldiers following the Marshlanders tried their best to stop the advance of the army of the dead, although they did achieve a certain degree of success at the beginning. But the opponent used the method of 1 force over 10 skills. Even if the whites were stuck in the quagmire, the whites behind would step on the bodies of the whites in front and bite these guerrilla Marshlanders and coalition soldiers to death. All this disappeared after the Night King took action. The rotten silt froze into hard ground, and the boats in the complex river channel of the Reed Marsh were frozen, and could not move. The army of the dead moved freely in the neck, and countless Marshlanders and coalition soldiers were slaughtered. They didn't even have the strength to resist. Grey Water Watch, the most mysterious and hard to find castle in Westeros, was breached. Howland Reed, the mysterious leader of the Marshlanders, is said to have hanged himself in the hall of his castle. His daughter Mira Reed and son Jojen Reed followed the allied soldiers to escape from the neck. The Battle of the Neck was a series of defeats, and the allied forces were broken up into small pieces. There were thousands of battles in half a month, but few victories. The morale of the allied soldiers reached an alarmingly low level during this process, and the army was demoralized and panic-stricken. This time, it was not just ordinary soldiers, but the entire army, including the king and the nobles, who were all shrouded in a layer of despair. The neck is the most hopeful line of defense for humans to stop the White Walkers. In order to stop the White Walkers in the neck, the allied forces have exhausted all their energy, manpower, financial resources and material resources. They thought that the neck would be the second wall of despair in Westeros, a natural defense line that could not be crossed, and gave them unlimited hope. However, they did not expect that after they really encountered the White Walkers, this unbreakable defense line was as fragile as a piece of paper. Tycho Nestus, the manager of the Iron Bank of Bravos, wrote in his own record. He was the plenipotentiary representative sent by Bravos, responsible for handling the loan matters between the Iron Throne and the Iron Bank. At the same time, He was also in the camp of the coalition forces and was the most important landlord. Therefore, he could personally experience and hear many secrets that were not disseminated to the outside world. And his judgment on the situation on the continent of Westeros from what he saw and heard would naturally be transmitted back to the city of Bravos, becoming the basis for the decision of Lord Seeking. According to Tycho Nestus's judgment, Westeros has reached a critical moment of life and death. The White Walkers breaking through the neck means that the morale of the coalition forces is about to reach the brink of collapse. If King's Landing falls, I'm afraid that Westeros will not be far from completely falling. It was the new year of the 293rd year of the Egan calendar, but for the Baratheon dynasty it was called the 293rd year of the Conquest calendar. The desperate coalition forces fought a desperate battle on the Green Fork and the Twins on New Year's Day. They even changed their previous tactics of strict defense and launched a desperate charge against the army of the dead. Countless knights from the families, wearing bright armor, charged at the forefront with strong shields and spears. Kill. On the banks of the Green Fork, the shouts of killing shook the earth. As the king of the Seven Kingdoms, Robert Baratheon did not listen to anyone's persuasion this time, but personally charged forward with a warhammer in his hand. The king charged ahead, and the other nobles of the Seven Kingdoms naturally had no face to retreat behind. Eddard Stark also accompanied his good brother. The king's eldest brother Stannis did not abandon his brother, and fled back to Dragonstone. The Knights of the Riverlands, the Valley, the soldiers of the West, the River Bay, etc. The coalition soldiers fought for their hometowns behind them, and burst out several times of potential and courage and desperation. If they failed, they would die. If they failed, the hope of the Seven Kingdoms would be cut off. However, courage could not defeat absolute power after all. Looking down from the clouds in the sky, the number of whites and the coalition soldiers of the Seven Kingdoms on the ground was not proportional at all. Moreover, the number of whites was still increasing, and the figures of the coalition soldiers were constantly falling one by one. The extremely exaggerated power comparison was still being eroded and shrunk at a geometric speed. The blood dyed the frozen river red, the broken ice rushed with cold river water, and corpses fell on the riverbank. Old Lord Free stood on the bridge of the Twins. He looked at the battlefield in the distance and finally showed despair in his eyes. Then he loosened his hands and fell from the bridge in freefall. He jumped into the Green Fork River and wanted to end his life. Bang! However, the body of Old Lord Free did not break the hard river ice. The back of his head hit the ice surface heavily, and a shallow white pit was smashed out. The blood gushing out of the back of his head quickly dyed the ice red, but his body was not dead yet. He struggled slightly, and his demold eyes looked at the sky without focus. However, at this moment, a loud roar of a giant dragon suddenly came from the distant horizon, and it quickly spread to all directions. The Night King, who was riding a horse behind the army of the dead, suddenly raised his head and looked at the sky. The ice blue flames burning in his eyes jumped sharply. Create a new book friend group. The group number is 719,531,110. You can add it if you want to join. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 392, Divine Soldiers Descend from the Sky. Ho! The roar of the dragon spread far in the sky. The king, nobles, and allied soldiers who were fighting with the whites on the ground all looked up at the sky. They had never heard the roar of the dragon. This sound had disappeared from the land of Westeros for 100 years, and now it reappeared again. Robert, what's that sound? Eddard Stark, holding the Valyrian steel sword Ice, smashed a white in front of him with one sword. He was slightly out of breath, and his body was covered with blood. It was unknown whether it was the blood of the white or the blood sprayed by the allied soldiers. King Robert, who was standing next to the Duke of Winterfell, was also panting and exhaling white mist. Bang! Then he raised the warhammer in his hand and smashed the head of a white with one hammer, and then smashed the chest of another white with a hammer, knocking the other away. His beard was stained with blood, and there was also blood splattered on his cheeks. He also heard the huge roar coming from above his head, exhaled a mouthful of white mist, then stopped fighting, and looked up at the sky. Unfortunately, the wind and snow on the banks of the Green Fork River were violent, and the goose feather snow kept falling down. The entire battlefield was covered with white and visibility was not very high. It was not clear what was happening in the sky above his head. "I don't know what this cry is," Robert panted, and his fat face was a little red, and then he shook his head. "It can't be worse." He was about to say that it couldn't be worse, but at this moment, the roar of the dragon above his head sounded again, shaking his soul. This time the distance was closer, as if it sounded above the battlefield. This time, all the nobles and allied soldiers on the ground battlefield, including Robert and Edward, saw what it was. How the cold winter wind howled, and a looming huge figure was quickly shuttling through the violent snowstorm. It spread its huge wings, tearing open the white world, and its body, that covered the sky and the sun, squeezed in. Ho! The dragon's roar was low and suppressed, penetrating the thick clouds and snow, and spreading far away. A pair of scarlet eyes overlooked the dense army of whites on the ground. The young dragon rider sitting on the dragon's back was wearing a silver Valyrian steel armor and a scarlet longsword on his waist. He did not wear a helmet, but hung it to the side. His long silver gold hair fluttered in the wind, revealing a clean and handsome face. This young knight was the young dragon Lord Viserys Targaryen, who came all the way from Pentos. "I'm a little late." He overlooked the battlefield below. The army of the Seven Kingdoms was divided into two groups. Viserys personally led more than 20,000 Dothraki howling warriors, and prepared to land at White Harbor according to the original plan, to support the coalition forces stationed at the Bay of Kaelin and jointly attack the White Walkers. The other army, the Golden Group with more than 10,000 mercenaries, was led by another dragon king of the Targaryen family, the eldest princess of the new dynasty, Rhaenys Targaryen. However, the plan was well formulated. The first batch of Targaryen troops, including logistics, supplies and laborers, totaled 40,000 people and left Pentos. Countless warships covered the sea and sailed towards Westeros. However, the battle plan changed before it was implemented. Viserys did not expect that the coalition forces would be defeated so quickly in the Bay of Kaelin. The Neck, as a huge natural moat separating the north and south of Westeros, was easy to defend and difficult to attack. The coalition forces were defeated too quickly, which directly disrupted Viserys' plan. It had been almost a month since he received the message while drifting on the sea. The 20,000 Dothraki he led successfully landed at White Harbor, but it had already turned into a ruin. But the scattered whites left behind in White Harbor were naturally unable to stop the 20,000 brave and warlike nomadic cavalry. They were humiliated and teased, and were torn apart by 5 horses. Some whites were even captured alive. The Dothraki were natural cavalrymen, riding on horseback, and using superb riding skills to make the whites run around. Then they used the lasso technique to accurately put the rope around the neck of the whites and captured a group of living whites alive. And these whites were loaded into wooden cages and dragged onto the warships under Viserys' arrangement. Viserys was going to send them back to Pentos and asked Dr. Marwyn to study it to see if he could find any other undiscovered weaknesses of the whites, or give the Legion soldiers who have not yet boarded the ship to Westeros a little psychological expectation that they will face such enemies in the future. However, these whites are not zombies infected with a T-virus. The reason why other humans bitten to death become whites is because of the magic of the White Walkers. Therefore, Viserys is not worried about the bitter consequences of these whites being taken to Pentos. The remaining ones can be opened in a zoo in Pentos to exhibit these whites to the public. I'll charge some admission fees. After landing in White Harbor, 20,000 Dothraki set up camp in this deserted and prosperous city. White Harbor was basically not seriously damaged and was directly taken over by the Targaryen army. After all the matters, after landing in Westeros were arranged, Viserys abandoned these troops and flew alone on a dragon to the south of the Neck, the main battlefield of the coalition and the White Walkers, just in time for the decisive battle in front of him. How the wind was whistling in Viserys' ears, and his long silver gold hair fluttered in the wind. He held the saddle rings tightly with both hands, squinted his violet eyes slightly to prevent the wind and snow from blowing into his eyes, and Viserys looked at the chaotic battlefield below. The situation is not good. The situation on the battlefield was very clear. The coalition forces were in a desperate situation. It was only a matter of time before they were defeated or even annihilated. They can't all die now. Therefore, Viserys did not hesitate too much and controlled Balerion to dive down. Ho! A desolate dragon roar came from the sky. The huge dragon stretched its wings and quickly dived to the ground. Then a sea of red fire fell from the sky. Dragon flame. Viserys sat on the dragon's back with a tense face and spoke in a low voice in High Valyrian. Boom. The next second, a dazzling pillar of fire fell from the sky and directly submerged the running whites on the ground. Rumble. Balerion flapped his wings and flew forward. The dragon flames he spewed hit the ground and continued to move forward. It was like cutting a piece of cake, plowing a long gully in the dark and endless tide of whites. Countless corpse ghosts howled in the surging dragon flames and then fell down. The pressure on the allied soldiers was greatly reduced in an instant. Chapter 393, Facing the Night King. Dragon. It's a giant dragon. The allied forces, who had already fought a desperate battle, were a little surprised at the sudden reinforcement that came from the sky, but then they woke up and shouted loudly. Although the giant dragon has disappeared from this world for more than 100 years, the story of the giant dragon is still widely circulated in the Seven Kingdoms. The allied forces, who were in a desperate situation, burst into cheers like a tsunami. Many soldiers even couldn't help crying with joy, seeing the light in despair. Dragon. The one on the dragon's back is your highness. Oh my god, we have reinforcement. The sharp-eyed soldiers saw the young dragon rider riding on the dragon's back at a glance. Although they couldn't see his face clearly, they saw that he had a very iconic silver gold long hair. This is the symbol of the Orthodox royal family that has ruled Westeros for nearly 300 years. This symbol has long been deeply rooted in the hearts of the people of the Seven Kingdoms. Viserys was crowned on Dragonstone and became the king of Essos, but for the people of the Seven Kingdoms, the most direct impression of Viserys was still that he was the second prince of the Targaryen family, not the king. After all, he had not sat on the Iron Throne. The huge figure of the Black Death kept flying in the sky and then spewed out blazing flames to burn the whites to death. Countless whites turned into ashes in the dragon flames, saving the lives of countless coalition soldiers. Ed, wake up. Hey, don't play dead. I saw you open your eyes. In the smoke and fire, the surging dragon flames just now fell in front of Robert's eyes, blasting the whites who were just screaming in front of him into ashes. The red fire column spewed out by the dragon plowed a deep gully on the ground and led straight to the distance, without noticing Robert at all. The kings of the Seven Kingdoms didn't care about their dignity and were so scared that they just lay on the ground with their butts sticking out. But even so, the king's cheeks were blackened by the dragon's flames, only his eyes were still bright, and his black beard was curled by the flames, looking a little embarrassed. After Robert Baratheon got up from the ground in a mess, he pulled up the Duke of Winterfell who had also fallen to the ground with him, and was still a little frightened. Then he asked loudly, Ed, hey. Is this a fucking dragon? Ed had just gotten up from the ground, gasping for breath. His long dark brown hair was messy, and his eyes were still a little uneasy, looking up at the huge figure flying and spewing flames in the distance. He was also shocked just now, and even now he was still a little frightened. He thought that he and Robert were going to be burned to death by the dragon's flames, and the Valyrian steel sword ice, which was passed down from generation to generation, was thrown aside. But he didn't expect that the dragon rider sitting on the dragon's back didn't notice the little man on the ground at all and didn't want to burn him to death with a breath of dragon flame. Yes, that's right. Robert. Ed had patted the dust off his body, took a deep breath, and calmed his frightened mood. Then he bent down and picked up the Stark family's heirloom weapon from the ground, and then he didn't care about the dignity of the Duke of Winterfell. Congratulations, this is a fucking dragon. However, when Robert heard his good brother's words, he not only did not show the fear, anger or other negative emotions that he should have, but laughed out loud, and the fat on his belly was shaking slightly. Ha ha ha. Eddard Stark heard Robert's heartless laughter and felt that his nose was about to be crooked by anger. Respected Robert, or what kind of shitty king? Then the Duke of Winterfell couldn't help but swear again. For Edward, the honor and etiquette of the nobility were all thrown behind his mind on the battlefield that made people's blood boil and was full of dangers. Edward pointed at Robert's nose and shouted loudly, "I must remind you that dragons belong to your enemies. Not you. Not you. It almost burned us to ashes just now. When the war is over, its owner will want to put your head on the tip of a spear and parade it through the streets." But after Ed had finished speaking, Robert did not think of stopping laughing. The smoke of gunpowder was still everywhere around them as they stood on the battlefield. Then the king of the Seven Kingdoms slightly restrained his smile, waved his hand and said indifferently, "I don't care how I will die in the future. That will happen in the future, Edward. At least I know that, now that I have the help of dragons, I will not die immediately at the hands of the damn White Walkers, let alone become these disgusting monsters. I'm the king of the Seven Kingdoms in the Riverlands, the Vale, and King's Landing." Robert pointed his thick fingers at his chest. "I can't watch my people die at the hands of the White Walkers." This is also the reason why Robert was unwilling to retreat in front of the twins, and even had the intention to die, because if he died, he would not see it. As long as he was alive, he could not allow these things to happen. "Everyone, follow me and kill." The cheeks of Robert Baratheon, the king of the Seven Kingdoms, were blackened by the dragon flames. Then he raised the storm hammer in his hand and shouted, "Ha!" With the help of the dragon, the morale of the coalition army instantly reversed 180 degrees and became as powerful as a rainbow and rushed towards the army of whites. In the sky far away from the core battlefield, Viserys was riding a dragon and flying towards the rear of the army of whites. Rumble. Balerion lowered his flight altitude, spewing dragon flames and bombarding the surface of the Green Fork River. The hard ice surface was instantly broken, and countless whites standing on the ice fell into the cold and turbulent river. Viserys sat on Balerion's back, the wind whistled in his ears, and his pair of violet eyes locked on the White Walkers not far away. He saw the White Walker with the ice crown on his head in the middle at a glance. "He is the Night King." Viserys' heart tightened slightly. In the distance, hundreds of skeleton horses stood quietly behind the army of the dead, without making any sound. They watched the giant dragon spit out dragon flames and burn a large number of whites to death, but they were indifferent. The Night King held the reins with one hand and stared at the young dragon rider on the dragon's back, while Viserys was also looking at him from afar. The two looked at each other. Clang. Viserys pulled out the dusk from his waist. Ha. The Night King made a bone-chilling sound, then stretched out his hand, and an ice short spear gradually condensed in his hand, and then he aimed at Viserys and threw it out. A mere mortal was not worthy of his personal attack, but the human in front of him seemed to be no ordinary mortal. Whoosh! The ice short spear tore through the air and made a sharp whistle, flying straight to the dragon rider on the dragon's back. Chapter 394, The White Walker's Retreat. HMM. The dragon rider sitting on the dragon's back immediately sensed the danger. He saw the ice spear thrown by the Night King. His clear eyes narrowed slightly, and he clenched the star sword in his hand. "Balerion," Viserys said in a low voice. "Ho." The dragon roared and lowered its altitude slightly, but it still couldn't get rid of the short spear thrown by the Night King. The ice short spear made a sharp sound that tore through the air, piercing through the white wind and snow, and flew straight to the dragon rider on the dragon's back. The Night King wanted to kill the dragon rider who made him feel threatened. Viserys saw that he couldn't dodge, and his eyes flashed with a light purple light, and a complex magic circle appeared in his eyes. Eye of the moment. Then he tilted his head slightly, swung the scarlet sword in his hand, and chopped the ice short spear. Boom. Instantly, a loud noise broke out in the air. This was the first round of fighting between the Night King and the Dragon King. The ice short spear suddenly exploded into pieces of ice scattered all over the ground. May the seven gods bless his royal highness. The coalition soldiers and nobles of the Seven Kingdoms who rushed up from afar saw the fight between the Dragon Knight and the Night King. Their hearts were all in their throats, and some even began to pray silently. The Dragon Knight is the last glory and hope of mankind, supporting the high-end combat power of the coalition. If Viserys is shot and killed here, the hope that has just risen in mankind will fall into the abyss again. The Night King once used this trick to almost shoot and kill the Guardian of the North and the King of the Seven Kingdoms. Many soldiers have seen the power of the Night King's trick. Throwing a spear with bare hands is like firing a giant crossbow, and it is extremely accurate, directly blowing up the snow shed on the wall. Oh my god. This. However, when they saw the ice spear being shattered by Viserys' sword and exploded in the air, they all cried out in surprise and some were dumbfounded. They did not expect Viserys to be able to shatter the spear thrown by the Night King with one sword. As a dragon rider facing the Night King, Viserys sat on the dragon's back, tightened his belt, and the wind whistled in his ears. He held Dusk in his hand and grasped the saddle ring on the dragon's back with one hand. He bore all the pressure of the Night King. Roar. Then the dragon's wings suddenly vibrated violently, making a deafening dragon roar, flying close to the ground, and then quickly raising the altitude, shuttling through the white wind and snow. Whoosh whoosh, the wind whistled in his ears. If you want to defeat the White Walkers, you must kill the Night King. Viserys sat on the dragon's back, his eyes piercing through the wind and snow, and looking down slightly, holding Dusk tightly in his hand. Kill him. And on the ground below, the Night King still held the reins of the skeleton horse with one hand. He didn't even frown when he saw his attack blocked by the opponent, because he thought it was a matter of course. This dragon rider was a special existence below the gods and above mortals, just like himself, but this interval was very wide. Then, the Night King pulled out an ancient stone sword from his back. There was a layer of frost on the surface of the stone sword. This was the first time he pulled out the sword behind him. He had two swords. One was a transparent ice sword used by all the White Walkers, and the other was the stone sword behind him. He looked up at the white sky. The wind and snow were still violent, and a pair of eyes were dancing with ice blue flames, looking for the disappearance of the dragon. At this time, a dragon roar suddenly came from above his head. The Night King turned his head abruptly, and then what he saw was the overwhelming dragon flame pouring down from the sky. Dragon flame. Viserys gripped the saddle ring on the dragon's back and gave Balerion an order. Boom boom, the dragon roared and spewed dragon flames. Red pillars of fire fell from the sky and madly bombarded the ground. Several ancestors of the Stark family were affected and swallowed by the surging dragon flames. The light of the dragon flames was dazzling and could be seen from a long distance. The other White Walkers seemed to feel the threat as well. This time they no longer stood there stupidly, but controlled the skeleton horses under their crotches to flee into the distance. The wind and snow whistled in Viserys' ears, but not much snow fell on his body, because Balerion's body temperature was very high and all the snowflakes that fell on the dragon were melted. Can you kill him? The young dragon rider stared at the center of the dragon flame bombardment below and couldn't help but clenched his fists. He was not sure whether the dragon flame could kill the Night King. Then Balerion finished spitting out the dragon flame in one breath, and then his wings vibrated to raise his huge body, and the Black Death once again hovered in the sky. And below, the center of the dragon flame, which was shining brightly like a small sun, was slowly extinguished because there was no fuel. Viserys looked down through the wind and snow, and several ancestors of the Stark family, including their skeleton horses, had disappeared under the dragon flame. What disappointed him was that after the flames slowly died out, the Night King, who was in the center and was madly attacked by the dragon flame, was not burned to death. The Night King knelt on one knee on the charred ground, looking a little embarrassed. He held the ancient and mysterious stone sword tightly in one hand and blocked it in front of him. It seems that the stone sword played a huge role in the process of fighting the dragon flame. The Night King himself was unharmed, and the skeleton horse under him had been melted by the dragon flame. After feeling the surrounding flames extinguished, the Night King raised his head and looked at the black dragon hovering in the sky. The flames in his eyes flickered, and he slowly stood up from the ground. The huge figure of the dragon passed through the wind and snow and roared. At this moment, the battlefield was filled with smoke, and the white wind and snow were intertwined with the smoke, and the sky gradually turned pale. Dawn is coming. The other White Walkers turned a blind eye to the deaths of 3 of their kind, and all their eyes were focused on the Night King. The Night King hesitated for a moment, and then held the stone sword, and roared like the cracking of ice. On the battlefield ahead, a large number of whites seemed to have heard the Night King's order, and then slowly retreated like the ebb of the sea. The sea water retreated, leaving a mess everywhere. Countless coalition soldiers and nobles who rushed forward saw that the White Walkers had finally retreated, and even shouted hoarsely and couldn't cheer. After that, they could no longer hold on and fell to the ground. Some of them fell asleep, while others never woke up again because of their serious injuries. After a night of fierce fighting, the sky finally dawned. The human coalition also successfully repelled a round of attacks by the White Walkers for the first time since the war with the White Walkers began. Chapter 395, Post-War Trauma. We won, didn't we? Edit. The blizzard seemed to leave with the footsteps of the army of the dead. After a night of fierce fighting, the sky finally gradually brightened. The bright sunshine tore through the darkness and penetrated the dark clouds, sprinkling on the silent battlefield on the banks of the Green Fork. Robert Baratheon, the king of the Seven Kingdoms, lay on the charred land burned by dragon flames and was unwilling to get up. Beside him, Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, was also lying on the ground in a mess. Not far away, Stannis Baratheon, the distinguished Duke of Dragonstone and the brother of His Majesty the King, was holding a long sword with a bent blade, frowning slightly as he watched the military doctor bandage the wound on his hand. 4 fingers on his left hand were bitten off by a wight in a battle not long ago. If you look closely, you can see the throbbing veins on Stannis' forehead, but Stannis was like a stone, clenching his teeth and not saying a word. The military doctor who bandaged his wounds also admired the amazing willpower of this lord. Tywin Lannister, the Warden of the West, was also a little embarrassed. His lion armor was covered with blood and his golden cloak was torn. The Duke of Casterly Rock staggered to the spot and then was supported by the family knights. He was breathing heavily and there was a rare confusion in his eyes. My lord. Then the Duke of Casterly Rock still maintained his demeanor and climbed onto the warhorse with the help of the family knights. Not long ago, when the war was at its most intense, Edmure Tully, the heir of the Riverlands, who took advantage of the chaos and pretended to be dead on the battlefield, found that the war was over. Then Edmure wiped a few handfuls of blood on his face and took the opportunity when no one was paying attention to quickly climb up, supporting the hilt of the sword with one hand, and pretended to be exhausted and shaky, which made the soldiers of Reveron who were searching for him cry with joy. The surviving descendants of the Free family also found their ancestor who committed suicide by jumping on the ice on the frozen surface of the Green Fork River. However, at this moment, the body of the old Free was already cold. The surface of the Green Fork River was suddenly filled with the cries of the filial sons and grandsons of the Free family. Perhaps it was because the surface of the river was not frozen solid enough, or perhaps it was because the Night King led the army of the dead to retreat briefly, causing the temperature in the twins to rise slightly. The frozen surface of the Green Fork River was somewhat loose, and coupled with the large population of the Free family, there were quite a lot of people gathered on the ice. Suddenly, there was an accident of ice breaking without any warning. These mourning filial sons and grandsons of the Free family fell into the icy river with the bodies of their ancestors. The sudden change once again made the banks of the Green Fork River a mess, and people lent a hand to rescue the Free family members who fell into the water. Unfortunately, due to the vast surface of the Green Fork River and the severe cracking of the ice, boats were temporarily used for rescue. Many people were rescued and brought ashore, but in the end, more than a dozen people were washed away by the river along with the body of the ancestor of the Free family, and disappeared without a trace. On the banks of the Green Fork River, the cries of the Free family became louder and even more sincere. After the victory of the war, there are still many messy things. The Duke of Winterfell shook his head slightly after hearing the king's words. Don't be happy too early. This is just a short-term victory, Robert. Eddard Stark lay on the ground, his voice a little weak. The White Walkers will come back. The army of the dead was only repelled for a short time, perhaps to accumulate more strength, or perhaps for other purposes, but Eddard did not think that the White Walkers would give up and stop at the neck. A short-term victory is also a victory. Robert lay on the ground and took a few deep breaths, then sat up from the ground, patted the dust on his body, and looked very optimistic. At this time, suddenly, a dragon roared from the horizon, and a huge figure spread its wings and appeared in everyone's sight. Viserys, who had gone to chase the army of the dead, finally returned. Ho! The dragon roared, and a huge black shadow enveloped the ground. Then Balerion fell from the sky and landed in front of Robert Baratheon. Boom! The dragon landed with a huge sound, and the rolling airwaves spread to the distance. Robert Baratheon and Eddard who were sitting on the ground, were choked by the smoke and dust, and the coalition soldiers in the distance were also affected. What does your highness want to do? The nobles who were loyal to Robert Baratheon became nervous when they saw this scene, such as his two lost king's goods, but they did not dare to approach. After all, the big guy was still there, and more coalition soldiers chose to watch coldly, sitting on the ground with their weapons in their arms, and did not even stand up. Without the order of their own lord, they would not stand up to help. He is Viserys. Tywin Lannister, who was supported on horseback, looked at the heroic young dragon rider sitting on the dragon's back in the distance. But he couldn't see Viserys' face clearly, because the distance was too far. In the center of the storm, the two people who were most affected were choked and coughed continuously. Ahem. Pa. Robert spit out a mouthful of dust in a somewhat embarrassed manner, and Eddard Stark was not much better. Then when the dust drifted away, they could see the behemoth in front of them. Valyrian's scalded eyes were coldly examining the two little guys below. It knew that they had a grudge against Viserys, and it didn't know why Viserys stopped itself from killing them. Otherwise Valyrian would have eaten the two of them in one bite when it just fell down. However, at this moment, a clear voice suddenly came from above the heads of the two people below. Lord Robert Baratheon of Storm's End, and Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell. Viserys sat high on the dragon's back, with the Sword of the Stars on his waist. He wore a Valyrian steel helmet, so his face could not be seen clearly, but his voice came from under the armor, calm and without much ripples. I have heard of your names a long time ago, but I did not expect that our first meeting would be like this. Although Viserys' words sounded sarcastic, there was no such meaning in his tone, but it seemed very calm. He had indeed heard of the two people's names for a long time, but he did not expect to meet them in such a capacity and under such circumstances. Introduce yourself. Then, without waiting for the two to speak, Viserys untied the belt of his dragon riding equipment. Then he stood up from the dragon's back, and the silver armor shone in the sun. This was definitely the dream of countless nights. My name is Viserys Targaryen. Then the young dragon rider jumped off the dragon's back easily and landed heavily on the ground. Boom. The dust centered on this flew up in layers, and the man in the middle slowly stood up. He glanced at the two people in front of him and then said in a calm voice, "He is here to kill you." Chapter 396, Meeting of the Two Kings. As Viserys finished speaking, the two men in front of him suddenly became nervous. Eddard raised the Valyrian steel sword ice and stood in front of Robert. He spoke in a low voice, wanting to let his good brother go first. Robert Baratheon, who was standing next to him, had no intention of turning around and running away, nor did he raise the Stormbreaker in his hand. Although he was a reckless man, he didn't think Viserys would take action at this time, otherwise the dragon was next to him, and a breath of dragon flame would be able to burn the two to ashes. But Robert still spoke with some resentment. "Humph, Kit, you are so arrogant. If there is no dragon, Robert himself is also a fierce general on the battlefield and has extraordinary courage. Now he is in his 30s and is at the peak of his career. It is natural that he is a little angry when he is attacked by a young knight of 17 or 18 years old." Viserys also took off the Valyrian steel helmet on his head and held it in his arms, revealing a clean and handsome face, and his long silver gold hair shone in the sun. He heard Robert's words and turned his head slightly to look at him. "What? If there were no dragons, would you like to try?" With his current strength, it would be easy to kill the two people in front of him. When Valyrian fell just now, he could actually burn them to death with a dragon flame. The chief offender of the War of the Usurper must die, but now is not the best time to kill them. Viserys gave them a chance, that is, if he took off the crown and surrendered before landing in Westeros, he could allow Robert to retain the title of Duke of Storm's End. However, Robert ignored his goodwill, and when he led his troops to land in Westeros, the main war criminals who had set off the War of the Usurper must be tried by law. Treason should be sentenced to death in the laws of the Seven Kingdoms. Of course, they also have the option of wearing black clothes and going to the Night's Watch to serve a life sentence, and no commutation of sentence is allowed. However, whether this option will be applied in the trial depends on the will of the king himself. If the king is determined to let the rebels die, then even if he wants to wear black, it will be useless. Viserys will not execute the two people in front of him himself, because that would be too easy for them, and it would not have the effect of deterrence and warning others. He will defeat the army of the alliance led by Wolf, Deer, and Osprey, and then bring a fair and open trial for all the rebels in King's Landing, list the crimes, and punish them according to the crimes, so that their deaths can play the greatest role. Robert was choked by Viserys' words, his face flushed slightly, and he felt humiliated. Sitting on the Iron Throne, he was most concerned about the problem of the remnants of the Targaryen on the other side of the Narrow Sea. He had naturally heard about the rapid rise of the Targaryen family in recent years, the establishment of the Wooden City, the successive recovery of the Andals and the Rhoynar, the myth of the 200 people taking the city, the capture of the mountain, the killing of the Faceless Man, and the Dothraki alliance that defeated the Five Khals. Viserys' name even became more mysterious in the word of mouth of the Rangers and mercenaries in Essos, and he was called the first swordsman in the Free Trade City. Such a title has almost reached the peak of human strength in terms of personal martial arts, and the one who once had this honor was the chief swordsman of Bravos. After being choked, Robert did not directly challenge Viserys. HMPH. Robert groaned in frustration, but did not continue to talk about Viserys' topic. Instead, he looked up and down at the silver-haired young man who suddenly fell from the sky and saved the coalition. The other person's appearance made him feel familiar, and some past events could not help but resurface in his mind, and suddenly he felt a bit of bleakness, that things have changed. You are different from your father. Robert looked at Viserys, and then spoke abruptly. Looking at Viserys' face, that was very similar to someone in his memory, Robert could not help but clench his fist. However, he knew that the person in front of him was not someone in his memory. Although they were brothers, you and Rhaegar are different. Then Robert shook his head and added. The Duke of Winterfell, who was standing aside, put down the sword in his hand and looked at his good brother Robert in surprise. He never thought that Robert would speak to a Targaryen heir so calmly. Is it because of it? Eddard looked up, and a huge shadow was covering the ground. Balerion, the Black Death, was emitting white steam all over his body. His huge body was half lying on the ground, and his scalded eyes were examining the two people in front of him. Dragons can make people calm. And in the distance, after the dragon fell from the sky, everyone's eyes were focused here. The beating of the tickings. Eddard became a foil, because the distance was too far and no one knew what Viserys and Robert talked about. In addition, with the presence of the dragon, others did not dare to approach easily. They still remembered the horror of the dragon burning the banks of the Green Fork not long ago. At that time, the dragon was their ally, but now if they approached, the dragon would become an enemy, which was something that all the survivors of the coalition did not want to see. The nobles of the Seven Kingdoms and the soldiers of the coalition were all looking at this sight nervously, fearing that the negotiations would break down, and the two sides would go to war. Then they were slightly relieved to see that the two kings were at peace and there was no tension. What is the probability of success in sniping Viserys with a giant crossbow from here? Stannis dealt with the four fingers on his left hand that were bitten off, raised his hand, and looked at his empty left hand, which was still losing blood. Then he turned his head and asked his trusted aide, Onion Knight Davos. The Onion Knight was still looking at Stannis' left hand in a trance, and I don't know what he was thinking about. Then he was slightly stunned when he heard his words, and then thought about it seriously, and actually answered seriously. I don't recommend you do this, Lord Stannis. The accuracy of the crossbow is not high. They are too close. It is very likely that His Majesty the King or Lord Eddard will be injured by mistake. And even if Viserys is sniped, the dragon, Sir Davos answered seriously, but Stannis did not listen. HMPH. The Duke of Dragonstone just snorted and laughed inexplicably, as if he wanted to say something but stopped. He shook his head, patted Davos on the shoulder, and then walked away. The Onion Knight stood there a little confused, and then added to Stannis' back. Hey, Lord Stannis, we don't have a crossbow now. In the distance, the short meeting between the two kings ended. But it was better to say that the two people stood on the side of the road and chatted for a few words, but the tone was not so harmonious. Then Viserys got on the dragon again. Balerion let out a low roar, shook his wings, and flew into the sky. Chapter 397. Airborne landing on Dragonstone. The Battle of the Green Fork is over. The Seven Kingdoms paid a huge price for this battle, resulting in the most tragic casualties since the beginning of the war. Tens of thousands of soldiers died on the spot, and countless people were injured. The coalition launched a desperate charge against the army of the dead, and was once in a desperate situation, but in the end, with the help of the dragon that descended from the sky, they stubbornly repelled the attack of the White Walkers. The army of the dead withdrew back to the neck to restore their strength. And humans have also achieved the most brilliant victory since the beginning of the war. That is, they successfully repelled an attack by the White Walkers. But the corresponding price is naturally needless to say. At the same time, the Battle of the Green Fork also refreshed the record of the highest nobleman who died in the human army in the war against the White Walkers. Lord Walder Free jumped into the river and committed suicide, successfully refreshing the previous records of the Earl of Golden Tooth and the Earl of Hearth. It's just that this way of refreshing is not very glorious, but it has also become an interesting piece of cold knowledge in the human war against the White Walkers. The historic and far-reaching meeting between Viserys and Robert Baratheon finally achieved some results. The two sides reached a series of verbal consensus, such as cooperation in fighting the White Walkers, and both sides knew what would happen after the war against the White Walkers ended. After the meeting, Viserys boarded the dragon and left the battlefield of the Green Fork River, flying across the neck and returning to White Harbor. His large force of up to 20,000 Dothraki cavalry remained in White Harbor on standby. The war here was temporarily over, but the turmoil in Westeros was not over yet. Prince Doran sat firmly in Sunspear, while the Dawn army began to move intensively at this time, with a large number of troops stationed at the Prince's Pass, seriously threatening the safety of the nobles in the borderland. The nerves of Highgarden Rose suddenly tensed up, and she also summoned her vassals to discuss countermeasures, and at the same time, asked for help from Storm's End, hoping to get help from the Stormlands if a war broke out between the Reach and Dawn. Unfortunately, the letter of help from the Tyrell family fell into the sea after it was sent to Storm's End, and no response was received. Mace Tyrell, the Duke of Highgarden, was extremely anxious. At this time, he suddenly missed his beloved general, Lord Randall Tarley of Hornhill. If the famous general of the Southland, Randall Tarley, was here in Dawn, he would not be so presumptuous. At the same time, he also had many complaints about the Duke of Storm's End, Renly. The Tyrell family has made an alliance with the Baratheon family. When his daughter Marguerite Tyrell, the Little Rose of Highgarden, has her first period, she will be able to marry Prince Joffrey of the Baratheon family. The two powerful families should have supported each other in times of crisis, but the Duke of Mace did not expect Renly to be so weak that he was scared by Dawn and stayed indoors. However, a few days later, news from King's Landing reached Highgarden, and Mace Tyrell realized what had happened, causing Storm's End to be unable to take care of itself. It turned out that a fleet traveling back and forth between Westeros and Essos brought an explosive news. The false King Viserys Targaryen III of Pentos, located on the other side of the Narrow Sea, has decided to send troops to Westeros. It is impossible to conceal that tens of thousands of troops set sail from the port of Pentos, not to mention that there are two dragons, so the news has spread to King's Landing long before the army arrived in Westeros. The army from another continent is approaching, and the people in King's Landing are suddenly in a panic. However, at this time, the news of the death of Jon Arryn, the regent and prime minister, could no longer be concealed, and now the regent sitting on the Iron Throne is Queen Cersei. There are even rumors that Queen Cersei sent someone to kill the king's hand, and claimed that it was because Lord Jon found evidence of incest between the queen and her brother. Cersei ordered the news of the Targaryen army crossing the sea to be blocked, and strictly prohibited from leaking out. At the same time, the city gates were closed, and could only be opened at a fixed time, and at a fixed point. Curfews were enforced, high-pressure rule was imposed, and rumors were prohibited. Those who violated the ban were all hung on the city walls and sunbathed to death. Under the order of the Queen Regent, King's Landing completely became a coward, ignoring the source of the news, and did not send a fleet to investigate on the sea. The next day, on Dragonstone, an ordinary morning, the breeze was warm and the sun was bright. The surging waves kept beating and washing the reefs on the island, and the magnificent black castle stood on Dragonstone. This castle is completely built of black stone, which is a lost stonework technology in Valyria, so it is different from the castles in Westeros. The flag of the Baratheon family flew above the stone drum tower, the main fortress of Dragonstone, with a black crowned stag on a gold background. This is a branch of the Baratheon family. It is the fief of Stannis Baratheon, who was named the Duke of Dragonstone after the War of the Usurper. Now Stannis has responded to his brother's call to fight against the White Walkers and left Dragonstone for a long time. His youngest daughter, Shireen, who is only 4 years old, has even forgotten what her father looks like. Now the little girl Shireen Baratheon is having breakfast in the restaurant, accompanied by her mother, Selise Florent. However, at this moment, a melodious and desolate horn sounded suddenly on the sea, followed by the dense alarm sound on the Dragonstone castle, and the bells and horns sounded at the same time. Bang! At the same time, a guard of the Baratheon family hurriedly pushed open the door of the restaurant and walked in, scaring Selise and her daughter who were having dinner. "Madam, something bad has happened." Selise Florent's face showed a little displeasure, but the Duchess of Dragonstone has a very good aristocratic upbringing. She also heard the warning horn, which showed that something had happened. Therefore, she did not blame the guards, but put down her spoon and asked patiently, "What happened outside? Why is it so rough?" However, before the guards could explain anything, at this moment, boom, a loud noise suddenly came from the top of the dining room where the mother and daughter were staying in Dragonstone Castle. It was as if some huge monster had fallen on the castle, and the dust above the head fell down, scaring everyone in the castle. Miss Shireen Baratheon, who was only 4 years old, was frightened and cried immediately, and her mother Selise Florent was also frightened. Her face turned pale, and she became a little panicked. "What's going on? What happened?" On the sea. The entire sea was densely covered with warships at some point, and there was no end in sight. On each ship, the flag of the Targaryen family and the emblem of the Golden Group were flying high. The eldest princess of the new dynasty, Rhaenys Targaryen, personally rode her green dragon regal to the castle of Dragonstone. The dragon stepped on the castle and roared deafeningly. The defenders of Dragonstone were trembling with fear, and then they dropped their weapons and knelt down to beg for surrender. Chapter 398, Conquering Dragonstone. Roar. The roar of the giant dragon made Dragonstone tremble. The servants in the castle were so scared that they ran away and trembled. The mother and daughter of Dragonstone also hid in the restaurant and dared not show up. The defenders of Dragonstone were also a little panicked. Then they saw the overwhelming warships on the sea heading towards Dragonstone. They finally showed desperate expressions on their faces, put down their weapons, and knelt down to beg for surrender. The Golden Group led by Rhaenys easily took Dragonstone without any effort. The defenders of Dragonstone surrendered without any resistance. Then the soldiers of the Golden Group successfully landed and controlled the entire Dragonstone. Her Royal Highness the Princess is so powerful that no one can match her. The commander of the Golden Group, Mythtoin, was wearing heavy plate armor and a black cloak on his back. He stepped on the muddy land on the coast of Dragonstone, looked up at the crater above his head with white smoke billowing, and couldn't help but sigh. Giant dragons were flying in the sky. The Dragonstone volcano was billowing smoke. There were endless warships, and a large number of soldiers in armor were ready to go. For a moment, Mythtoin seemed to be in the grand scene 300 years ago, when Aegon was about to conquer Westeros. The Dragon Knight Rhaenys was also standing on the coast. She was wearing tailor-made women's armor, long brown hair, a black and red cloak on her shoulders, a dragon head medal, and a long sword on her waist. She looked heroic. "Thank you for the compliment, Lord Mythtoin, but I'm still far behind my brother." She heard the compliment from Mythtoin, then shook her head and spoke modestly. When Mythtoin heard the words of the princess, he slightly tilted his head and looked at her. He knew that sometimes the eldest princess would call his majesty brother. There was nothing strange about this. After all, the eldest princess was a few years older than the other regent princess. "Then what is your highness going to do next?" The commander of the Unsullied, Blackworm, stood beside Rhaenys with his hands behind his back, listening to the two people talking without saying a word. In this expedition plan, Viserys led the Dothraki to the front line, and the fleet responsible for escorting was Euron Greyjoy's Iron Fleet. Venus personally led the golden group of more than 10,000 people, and also selected 2,000 unsullied as the guards of Her Royal Highness the Princess, protecting her on both sides, and escorted by the Dragonston fleet of the Minister of the Navy, Lord Geoffrey Bracken. Viserys' plan was also considered. The demon gathering on his side was a dungeon of hell difficulty. Not only was the enemy he faced very terrible, but the soldiers under his command, whether the Dothraki, the Iron Fleet, or Euron Greyjoy, were not easy to deal with. He was worried that Rhaenys would not be able to deter these people. Therefore, all of them were led by Viserys himself, and he left Rhaenys with relatively simple entry-level tasks for novices. With the giant dragon Regal, the loyal Unsullied protecting them, the old man Lord Geoffrey Bracken, etc. The Golden Group is as gentle as a little lamb compared to the Dothraki and Euron. After Rhaenys captured Dragonston, her first major task was to build a supply line between Pentos and Dragonston to ensure that the army could advance without worries. This way, be careful. The surrounding Golden Group soldiers walked around, constantly busy loading and unloading war supplies. Then the Unsullied soldiers wearing new dragon scale armor and full sets of weapons and equipment led the way. Her Royal Highness Princess Rhaenys walked in front, and the Golden Group's Legion Commander, Mythtoin, followed behind her. The group climbed the long stairs to the Black Castle on Dragon Mountain on Dragonston. Rhaenys once spent her childhood here. She was particularly familiar with every flower, grass, tree, and stone. However, as time passed, the memories of the past became blurred. It has changed so much. Since Stannis landed on Dragonston, all the items and brocades related to the Targaryen family in the castle have been taken down, and the banners of the Baratheon family have been hung. Your Highness. Outside the castle gate, two fully armed Unsullied soldiers were waiting in full battle array. Rhaenys' personal guards, the Unsullied soldiers, have already controlled the castle. Now all the Dragonston defenders have been confiscated and imprisoned by the soldiers of the Golden Company. The Unsullied soldiers bowed their heads slightly when they saw Rhaenys and her group coming, and then turned around and pushed open the castle gate for Her Royal Highness the Princess. Rumble. The metal castle gate made a dull sound and slowly opened. If the Dragonston defenders had not seen the dragon landing and knelt down to surrender, it would probably take some effort to break through the castle. Rhaenys stood outside the city gate, but did not rush to go in. Instead, she stopped where she was, looking at the brocade with the crown of the Baratheon family stag fluttering above her head. Then she took it off and looked at it in her hand, then threw it on the ground and said to the Unsullied soldiers, "Clean up all these things, but don't waste them. Distribute them to the people on the island to make some clothes to wear. Compared to the emblems on the silk, the people know better who is better to them." Understood, Your Highness. The Unsullied soldier wore a helmet, lowered his head and agreed meticulously, and Rhaenys nodded with satisfaction, and then continued to walk into the castle. These silks woven with the emblem of the Baratheon family are all high quality silks, and the poor people will never be able to wear such gorgeous clothes in their lifetime. Logically, these things embroidered with the emblems of the hostile family should be destroyed in a centralized manner, but Rhaenys is kind-hearted and thrifty. The Baratheon family has only ruled Dragonston for a few years, and the Targaryen family has ruled Dragonston for nearly 300 years. Although all these silks had to be taken off and replaced with the emblems of the Targaryen family, she couldn't bear to burn these fine silks. So she distributed them to the people so that they could make a good piece of clothing for themselves. After receiving the order, the Unsullied soldiers went down to deal with these matters, and Rhaenys had already walked into the castle. Everything in the castle was very familiar to Rhaenys. Every room, every corridor, the empty hall, and the stone throne in the middle. Rhaenys remembered that Viserys met the envoys of Bravos here before leaving Dragonston, and she had sat on it before. It was cold and hard, not very comfortable. However, she did not expect that one day she would return here as a conqueror. The girl with long brown hair was wearing bright armor all over her body. She stood in the hall and looked at the throne in the middle with a little daze, her eyes complicated. Because of being too familiar, Viserys did not notice that with the passage of time, the two girls who were once carefree have gradually grown up, and each has their own worries. The Black Bug stood with his hands behind his back, and the Legion Commander Mythtoin did not say a word, for fear of disturbing Rhaenys. After a long while, Venus came back to her senses and smiled a little apologetically. Sorry. Then he looked around and asked, I heard that the wife and daughter of Stannis Baratheon, the usurper's brother, were captured? Where are they? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 399, Conquering Cheotao Island. Celis Florent and her daughter were still in the dining room of the castle, but the Baratheon soldiers around them had been escorted out and replaced by unsullied soldiers. Then they saw Inez pushing the door and walking in. The mother and daughter were still trembling. The little girl Shireen was so scared that she couldn't stop crying, but her mother Celis Florent had some of the temperament of the Duchess of Dragonstone. She saw Inez walking in and suppressed her fear, then put her daughter in her arms aside, stood up from the chair and bowed slightly. Your Highness. Through the unsullied soldiers just now, she also learned that the one who led the army to attack Dragonstone was the niece of the false King Viserys, the eldest Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, another dragon rider in the Targaryen family. Rhaenys looked at the little girl crying in front of her, and the woman who pretended to be calm, but was trembling under her clothes, and sighed slightly. She did not embarrass the poor mother and daughter. She said a few simple words, and did not put Celis and her daughter in jail. Instead, she allowed them to continue living in the castle until Stannis was captured, or the war was over. It was an unspoken rule among the nobles that the family should not be punished. They would always leave a way out for everything. Otherwise, there would not be so many ancient families that have been passed down for hundreds of years. However, Celis and her daughter were not allowed to leave the castle and were restricted to the surveillance of the soldiers. Rhaenys then sat on the throne of Dragonstone and skillfully conveyed the orders. Because Viserys often left his post without permission, Rhaenys had experience in supervising the country for him. In addition, she also had a good teacher. Her uncle Oberyn was knowledgeable. The girl could handle government and military affairs skillfully at a young age. Therefore, Viserys was confident and bold to let Rhaenys lead a large army to Dragonstone. However, Dragonstone was not the end point of this army. Rhaenys was ready to go one step further. She sat on the stone throne in the main hall of Dragonstone and asked for the opinions of 3 commanders, namely the commander of the Golden Company, Maes Toyne, the commander of the Dragonstone fleet, Lord Geoffrey Bracken, and the commander of the Unsullied, Blackworm. Then she got a unified affirmative opinion. Then, the next day, the Targaryen army attacked Dragonstone, and the Dragonstone defenders surrendered without a fight. However, the Targaryen army only rested for one day before setting sail again and marched to another island not far from Dragonstone. Tidehead of the Valerian family. The Dragonstone fleet led by Lord Geoffrey Bracken, the Minister of the Navy, and some soldiers of the Golden Company went to Tidehead. The Valerian family was originally a distant relative of the Targaryen family. Both were families of the Freehold, but the Valerian family was not one of the ancient 40 families, but a new family that rose after the Empire. Long before Aena Targaryen led the entire family to migrate to Dragonstone, the Valerian family had already settled on Tidehead. In the early days of the Targaryen dynasty, the Valerian family had a decisive power within the dynasty. The first captain of the King's Guard and the Lord Admiral in history were both from the Valerian family. There was even a time when only the Valerian family could hold the position of Lord Admiral. People said that the position had become hereditary to the Valerian family. However, no matter how close the family is, it is ultimately difficult to resist the passage of time and interests. The Targaryen family fell in the War of the Usurper. The Valerian family began to declare neutrality, but in the end they secretly threw themselves into the arms of the usurper and backstabbed his distant relative. In the end, the royal fleet of Stannis and the royal fleet raided Dragonstone, causing the Dragonstone fleet to be almost annihilated. The fleet commander-in-chief, Lord Geoffrey Bracken, was shot in the chest and almost died on the spot. The Targaryen family also lost the last piece of territory in Westeros. However, now that the Targaryen family has made a comeback, it is time to avenge the betrayers one by one. The mighty Dragonston fleet carrying the soldiers of the Golden Group headed for Driftston, and the Driftston Valerian family, who claimed to be loyal and honest, had already been in chaos. Because they were very close, they noticed this morning that Dragonston had been captured by the Targaryen army. The Earl of Driftston, Montford Valerian, hurriedly asked for help from King's Landing, hoping to get support from the royal fleet docked in King's Landing. He also knew that he had betrayed the Targaryen family on the battlefield, and it was almost impossible to get forgiveness. Therefore, he also arranged for his wife and the newly born child Monterey and other family members to escape. Go. Take our children and escape to King's Landing. The handsome Earl Montford Valerian, wearing armor, stood at the port and kissed his wife, his long golden hair fluttering in the wind. Then the warship set sail and headed for King's Landing. Earl Montford stood on the observation deck and watched the warship carrying his family go away, and finally a relaxed smile appeared on his face. However, Lord Montford was too happy too early, and his plan was too late. The Targaryen army attacked Tidehead faster than Montford had imagined. The Dragonston fleet, filled with vengeance, came in droves, vowing to avenge the backstab, and surrounded Tidehead with ease. Boom boom boom, huge rocks flew into the sky and then fell. The ship carrying the family of Lord Montford Valerian of Tidehead had just left the port, and had not sailed too far, when it was bombarded by the catapults on the Black Death. In an instant, the Valerian family's warships broke into pieces, and sank into the sea, and Lord Montford Valerian, who was standing at the port, witnessed the whole scene, and was immediately furious. However, Tidehead was attacked by the Targaryen army. Countless soldiers of the Golden Group landed on Tidehead. The soldiers of the Valerian family fought desperately, but the difference in strength was too great. They were killed one after another, and the corpses were scattered all over the ground. Kill. The boulders burning with kerosene blasted open the gate of the castle like cannonballs. Lord Montford Valerian fought hard in the castle but was captured. He was then escorted to Dragonston in a panic. Blackwater Bay was breached by the Targaryen army overnight, and the army was approaching King's Landing. In the distant Pentus, a piece of good news suddenly came. It even alarmed Oberyn, who was training the army day and night to prepare to land in Westeros. He rode a fast horse and rushed to Pentus overnight under the escort of his personal soldiers. It turned out that the future Queen Princess Irian Martell was pregnant. According to the inference of the local doctor in Pentus, Irian should have been pregnant for 2 months. It was shortly after Viserys returned from the ruins of Valyria, and they were in a period of passionate love and happiness after a short separation. Unexpectedly, he was shot at that time. Chapter 400 Pregnancy. This piece of news was like a bombshell in Pentus, and it immediately set off an uproar. When the news leaked out, countless Pentus citizens, mercenaries, and sailors inside and outside the city couldn't help but discuss it, and even toasted to His Majesty the King in the tavern. The leader having an heir is the best insurance for the entire force and the interests of everyone. Viserys became famous at a young age, and shouldered the heavy responsibility of reviving the Targaryen family. Then, as he moved forward step by step, countless interest groups had gathered under the banner of Targaryen, and everyone relied on this banner to eat. From Pentus to Andalus, from the Tower of the Sentinels to the Norvus Mountains, from the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the Dothraki, the Unsullied Legion, the Golden Company, and so on. However, Viserys became famous too early, was not very old, held a high position, and had no children. His shortcomings were exposed long ago. For the leader of a force or the king of a country, it is very dangerous to have no offspring. The interests of all people cannot be guaranteed, and a seemingly powerful country can easily fall apart overnight. Just as the Sea-King of Bravos secretly sent the Faceless Man to assassinate Viserys. Their enemies all know that the biggest weakness of the seemingly unstoppable Targaryen family now lies in Viserys himself. If Viserys suddenly dies, it will be easy for the Targaryen family to fall into division without successors. After all, both princesses are dragon riders and are orthodox Targaryen heirs. Rhaenys is a few years older, has the title of the eldest princess, has rich regent experience, and has the support of Dorne and other soldiers behind her. Although Daenerys is young, her bloodline is purer than Rhaenys. She has a better reputation among the people with the title of Mother of Dragons, and also has the support of many Endel soldiers who followed Viserys the earliest. However, all this is based on the fact that Viserys has no offspring. If Viserys had an heir, all the problems would be solved. His heirs would only be his descendants, who would be supported by all the ministers under his command. In the Nine Towers Palace, now that Viserys and Rhaenys have left one after another, Pentos has entered the period of Daenerys' rule. Respected Stormborn, Mother of Dragons, Princess Daenerys Targaryen, the president of the Merchant Guild in the audience, crawled on the ground and called Daenerys' name loudly. Not long ago, the Merchant Guild and the workers at the port had a conflict, mainly because of salary and working hours. Pentos did not explicitly prohibit the abolition of slavery, so the slave problem still exists in this city, and in addition to slaves, there are a large number of workers. This time the conflict mainly came from a previous smashing incident. The silver-haired girl sat on the throne where Viserys and Rhaenys once sat, with a golden crown on her head and a little fidgeting, her pretty little face full of tension. Daenerys is now at an age where she can't sit still, but her brother just dumped this mess on her. After listening to the explanation of the head of the Merchant Guild and the complaints of the labor representatives, Daenerys took a deep breath. A pair of beautiful lavender eyes looked at the Prime Minister John Clinton beside her for help. She didn't understand what the two sides were saying at all. The grey red-haired man wore a golden badge of the king's hand. He felt the princess's request for help and thought for a while, then spoke. You can increase the treatment of 20% of the workers and reduce the working hours appropriately. The workers asked the merchants to double their wages, otherwise it would not be enough to live in the city of Pentos, where every inch of land is worth a lot of money. However, John Clinton did not support this request after thinking about it, but he still asked the merchants to restrain their greed. There are several main reasons. First, merchants are still the main taxpayers in Pentos. It is impossible for the city officials to receive taxes from ordinary workers, so they can only rely on merchants. However, the rising commodity prices has also collected taxes from the workers in disguise. The second is the issue of slavery. The price of slaves is not cheap in fact, but if the price of labor rises too sharply, such as requiring a 100% increase, then merchants would rather pay high prices to buy slaves and hire cheap labor. This is not good for the stability of the city and the healthy development of the economy. The Pentos government still encourages merchants to hire laborers rather than buy slaves. Slavery is a threat to the development of the country and the centralization of power. In addition, the current ruling trend of His Majesty, abolition of slavery is imperative, but the resistance to change is not small. John Clinton made a decision. The merchant representative bowed slightly, accepted the result and then retreated. The labor representative was a little dissatisfied, but seeing the cold eyes of the fully armed unsullied soldiers around him, he could only shrink his neck and say thank you for the decision of Her Royal Highness the Princess and then retreated. After the merchant and labor representatives retreated, John Clinton patiently explained to Daenerys why he made such a decision. In the final analysis, the royal power still represents the interests of the great nobles, but not completely. Rule is the foundation. Daenerys nodded as if she understood. Then another noble proposed that Princess Irian Martell's pregnancy in Pentos should be celebrated. This not only marks that the Targaryen family has a successor, but also proves that His Majesty the King is capable. Even if the child eventually miscarries, everyone is reassured. After all, they have been waiting for this reassurance for a long time. Irian has been pregnant for 2 months. She didn't care much about not having her period in the last month, but the relatives still didn't come in the second month. After the maid reminded her, she remembered to check, and then she got the good news. Whether Irian will give birth to a princess or a prince for Viserys, it is worth celebrating. The corresponding wedding of the two people should also be put on the agenda. Viserys originally planned to hold the wedding in King's Landing, after unifying the 7 kingdoms, but now it seems that it is very likely to be too late. Now Viserys is still fighting against the White Walkers in Westeros, and of course he knows nothing about the fact that he is suddenly going to be a father. Daenerys is still young, and she seems a little confused about the matter of men and women and the fact that her brother is about to have a child. But in the end, under the gaze of everyone, he nodded slightly and agreed. Aberin wrote a personal letter to tell his brother, Prince Doran, the good news. At this time, snowflakes suddenly floated outside the window. Aberin held the feather pen and stared at the scene outside the window. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.